Well, good evening and welcome to this unique event tonight for doubters only. We've coordinated this event and taken in a number of questions from folks that have doubts about the Christian worldview. And whether, as the questions were coming in, we realized there are different categories of doubters. There are non-Christians who have these questions or doubts about the Christian faith. There are questions from Christians relaying doubts of others, and then there are Christians who have doubts themselves. So we sort of have three categories, and we're going to be looking at a number of these questions tonight. Again, good evening. My name is Kurt Jaros. I'm the Executive Director of Defenders Media, host of the Veracity Hill podcast, and Director of Apologetics 315. So I wear a few hats in the apologetics world, but I'm so glad that you're joining us here this evening. We are multi-streaming to different platforms, so whether you're a follower of Mike Licona on YouTube or Facebook, follow my podcast, Veracity Hill, or like us on Apologetics 315, or as we say in the office, AP315 for short. I want to welcome you to tonight's event. I hope you have maybe got your dinner with you, or you've already eaten, because it's going to be a really fun time. We've already got some questions coming in from folks online, and I'm keeping tabs of the questions that come in there. Though we did make instructions for folks to email in initially, and so we've got questions. We'll attend to those to honor those questions before we touch on tonight. I see Aiden Peterson's already tuning in. Aiden, thanks for watching with us tonight. And now, before we jump to the questions, I'd like to introduce our two special guests, friends of mine, and one of them had the idea for doing an event like this. So first, let me introduce Dr. Gary Habermas. He's Distinguished Research Professor of Apologetics and Philosophy at Liberty University. He's a longtime New Testament scholar, studies the historical Jesus, presently working on his magnum opus, which I'm not sure when that will get done, Gary, but maybe you can give us some clues about that. And also joining us is his longtime friend, Mike Licona. Mike is the Associate Professor of Theology at Houston Baptist University, a New Testament scholar, has written some thick books, some heavy-weighted books, and some easy fictional works as well. Mike, not a lot of people know that you've written When Paul Meets Muhammad, a great little fictional debate there between those two guys. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the program tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Kurt.
Thanks, Kurt. Good to be with you.
Yeah, now, before we started casting here, you guys were just shooting the breeze like you'd been best buds for years, talking about sports, insulting each other, like you've been longtime brothers. Let me ask you guys this. How long have you known each other?
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, well, let's see. I met Gary first in the fall of 1985. So that's when I was having doubts about my faith, and someone recommended I go see Gary. I was in the New Testament Master of Arts and New Testament program. He was in teaching the apologetics and philosophy program. So had a roommate who was in that program. He suggested I see Gary, and that's how we met.
Nice. And so I was basically negative 2 years old at that point in 1985, but a figment in my parents' imagination. And, you know, having doubts is not anything new for people. Christians and non-Christians have been having doubts for a very long time, all the way back to the first century. We see people having doubts in the scriptures themselves. And one of my namesake, a lot of people don't know this, Kurt's my middle name. Thomas is my first name. Thomas, Doubting Thomas, has that perhaps the most famous pericope there in the Gospels about, basically he wouldn't believe it until he saw it himself. So he was a doubter himself. So people having doubts is nothing new under the sun. And so for Mike, someone like yourself, myself, I had questions. I never sort of left the faith that I grew up with, but I did have questions. And eventually I sort of came around to embracing the Christian worldview as the true one. But for people, everybody has a sort of different walk of life. And one person in particular has gone through a journey that sort of maybe spurred this event on. And Mike, you've been personally associated with with that, Marty Sampson, and I think Debbie, your wife in particular, has sort of had that one connection. Why don't you tell us?
Mainly Debbie.
Tell us a little bit about that situation.
Yeah, well, I think it was my son-in-law, Nick Peters, who alerted me to what was happening with Marty, that he was saying that he was questioning his faith. In fact, I think he said he was leaving it, and then he kind of backtracked on that. And so I told Debbie, because Marty Sampson's a worship leader, I'm not too familiar with the names of the people. I'd never heard of him. I'm just not, I haven't heard of a lot of great music top hits of the 1970s yet. My wife teases me about that all the time. It's just not my thing. So, but she knew about him immediately, and so she started to chime in with this, and so she was following him very closely, and she was communicating with him, not me. It was mainly her, and she was the one that set up a time for Gary and I to talk with him for a while. Plus the atheist John Loftus was on that call. But yeah, so we put out a video, Debbie and I did, and about doubting, and because I've experienced and wrestled with doubt in the past. It's just the way I'm wired.
And
I could really appreciate what he was going through.
Yeah, and when you say you're a doubter, I mean, it's not even just this area of study. You've got doubts about many things in life, and it's just sort of a second nature, if you will, to think critically about these things and to say, hey, maybe that's not really the case. Maybe there's something more to it, or maybe there's some information I don't even have. And so knowing you now for many years, I've certainly appreciated the humility that goes in stride with that. You sort of carry yourself with a posture of down to earthness, if I can call it that.
Well, I appreciate that.
All right. Well, so we've got questions that are pouring in online, which is great, and we've got these questions that came in ahead of time. And like I said, we want to honor some of the questions that came in through email. And there are three categories, again, from non-Christians that have doubts. There are from Christians who are relaying doubts from others. And then there are Christians who have some doubts themselves. So why don't we first start with the non-Christian group and sort of work our way down. And maybe, Gary, I'll toss this question to you first. This comes from Dean M. He asks, how do we know that Joseph of Arimathea was a real person? And is Arimathea even a real location historically?
Okay, well, to me, the way I would go at, let me first just mention my method. A lot of people know that I do this minimal facts argument for the resurrection. So does Mike. Mike developed it in his own dissertation. And I use that argument for just about anything now. It's just one of many ways to do reliability. And what I would do with any minimal facts question is to take data that scholars would recognize, critical scholars would recognize, and see what kind of a basis do we have. And with somebody like Joseph of Arimathea, you would bring all kinds of subcategories. Actually, many of the things Mike does with compositional devices, many of the things he does with tests for the veracity of the New Testament have a bearing on Joseph, because we have multiple attestation for Joseph's existence. For example, he's not just in the Synoptic Gospels, he's cited in the Gospel of John. We have the fact that his Richard Baucham's done a lot of important work on names, and John the Baptist, right? Joseph of Arimathea is a very obscure person. It says he was a secret disciple. Okay, so if you're secret, you're trying to keep things on the on low key, and so why pick Joseph? If you're going to pick somebody who's prominent, say Caiaphas buried him. Say that the centurion, put somebody else in there to do it, but not somebody that nobody can identify with. What's our Arimathea? Well, there's all kinds of debates on whether there was a town, where it is, what's going on. So why pick that? If someone's going to have an issue with it, why pick Arimathea? So a place name, a proper name of Joseph, multiple attestation. The fact that after he buries Jesus, I'm just thinking out loud here. I don't think he shows up again in the New Testament, does he, guys?
I don't think so.
I know it's pretty obscure. We don't normally pick obscure. All right, so I want to put my best foot forward, and I'll say, hey, I know so-and-so. Do you guys know so-and-so? No, you don't know him. Oh, well, then maybe I'll pick a different name because I want somebody on my side who's really well known. And all those factors, Joseph kind of flunks, except you want to flunk some of these things because to be obscure, to come from an obscure town, to be Jewish and yet to be a follower of Jesus, that's a little bit of bordering on enemy attestation. All these things help us argue that Joseph got involved. He went to Pilate. He asked permission. Talk about doubting. Pilate marveled, the King James word is, that Jesus was so soon dead. I like those words from the King James. And Pilate called the centurion in. It wasn't until he was sure Jesus was dead till he gave the body to Joseph. So in all these things, I think Joseph, for somebody who's unknown, comes in pretty well there against the evidence.
I think what's interesting, too, is the gospel authors, they describe things about Joseph, which tells the reader that they could go to verify whether this guy was a real person. So, for example, in Mark, he mentions that Joe was a respected member of the council. So that's something that first century folks could go and verify to see, hey, who was this guy? Was he real? What was his position? Was he really a Jesus follower?
By the way, some people, critics frequently question, like, say, what I think the best passage is for the deity of Christ, Jesus' own proclamation, Mark 14:41 to 43. Critics frequently say, how do we know what went on inside that council room? How do we know what was said? How do we know what Jesus claimed? And of course, there's a mention of John, the apostle, being a friend of the high priest. There's a reference. We have this reference to Joseph. We have the reference to Nicodemus. We have several sources that could tell us what happened in the room that night. And Joseph could certainly be one of the witnesses there. Just a little aside.
Nice. Okay, let's take another question here. Mike, why don't we throw this one your way? It comes from Erica. Is there anything other than the Bible that speaks of Jesus being resurrected? And Erica notes here, I want to go I think she means like all in, but I don't know how with questions like these. So, Erica seems like someone with genuine questions, genuine concerns, and she's wondering if there are external sources from the scriptures that mention Jesus being resurrected.
Well, that's a fair question. In fact, one of the first arguments I started to put together for the resurrection was, and doing it for a master's thesis, was what if we just used sources outside the Bible? That'd be really nice. But New Testament critics, even skeptical ones like Bart Ehrman or John Dominic Crossan or Gert Ludeman, people like that, they will still say the best sources we have for Jesus are the Gospels and the New Testament literature. So, we want to make sure that, of course, the Gospels and the New Testament literature, of course, they're going to be biased toward Christianity, but you could say the same thing about the Quran for Islam. You could say the same thing about Suetonius and Tacitus, about the Roman sources and things like that. Everybody's going to be biased to an extent. So just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean we should throw it out. Certainly not even skeptical New Testament scholars do that. That said, sure, we've got things like Clement of Rome and Polycarp. These were probably disciples of the apostles Peter and John, respectively, and they speak of Jesus's resurrection, meaning they would have gotten this from Peter and John, perhaps some of the other apostles. You've got, so they mentioned the resurrection. You have a possible passage in Josephus. It is a disputed passage, and it's in his Antiquities or Histories of the Jews, Book 18, Section 63. And in there, Josephus mentions Jesus and how, he was teaching among the Jews and the Gentiles, that he performed astonishing deeds. He doesn't use the word necessarily for miracle there. Paradoxis is what he uses. But it does mean astonishing deeds that astonished crowds. And So he acknowledges that. He says that at the instigation of the Jewish leadership, Pilate crucified him, and that his disciples continued to follow him, and that the tribe of Christians remain to this day. Well, the Greek text that we have of Josephus only says that he rose from the dead and appeared to them, and the tribe of Christians remain to this day. Now, it's weird that Josephus would say that, and because Origen says in the 3rd century that Josephus was not a Christian, so he wouldn't be saying Jesus rose from the dead. So most scholars believe that that is an interpolation in there put by a Christian, perhaps in the 2nd century, even though we don't have any manuscripts without it. And they are probably correct, though, that it was a Christian interpolation. However, Shlomo Pines in the 1970s found an Arabic text, which kind of has it, but it's toned down a little. It says they reported that he appeared alive to them 3 days later. And that would make a whole lot more sense, because Josephus was growing up in Jerusalem in the family of his father, who was a Jewish priest, a popular Jewish priest named Matthias. So that places Josephus chronologically and geographically in the very location where the apostles would have been preaching. And if the book of Acts is correct, that many of the Jewish priests were becoming Christians, then this would have been an interesting, the Christian message would have been an interesting discussion at the Josephus family dinner table. So Gary can tell you, he knows the literature better than anyone else, that one thing that goes undisputed is that the disciples were claiming that Jesus rose and appeared to them. In fact, they go even further and say the disciples had experiences they were convinced were the risen Jesus appearing to them. That's like 100% almost of all scholars saying that. But certainly, even a greater percentage would be saying that they at least were claiming it. That seems to be indisputable. So you would think if they are proclaiming this in Jerusalem, it just makes sense that Josephus would be saying they reported that he appeared alive to them 3 days later, and the tribe of Christians remain to this day. And in fact, a number of scholars would say that that is a very plausible scenario right there. So Josephus is a possibility. Tacitus doesn't mention the resurrection, but he does say something that is compatible with it. In his Annals of Rome, book 15, section 44, he mentions how Nero killed these Christians in all brutal ways because of their founder, Christus, whom the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate, put him to the extreme penalty. And he said Christianity was thus checked for the moment, and then it broke out in Judea, where the evil and mischievous superstition started and then spread throughout the entire world, even to the capital Rome itself. And that's entirely consistent with what we read in the Gospels and, of course, in the book of Acts, that Christianity was checked for the moment when Jesus was crucified. And then at Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, then they started proclaiming publicly Jesus' resurrection, and it went like crazy, spread like crazy. So although it'd be really nice if we had a report from a non-Christian that unambiguously and without question talks about the resurrection, or at least the disciples proclaiming the resurrection, that'd be nice. If we had a non-Christian saying Jesus rose from the dead, we wouldn't value that. We would think the person was a moron because they weren't a Christian, right? If they really believed Jesus rose, they'd be a moron, not a good source. But one other thing I'll add, and then I'll stop. We have a fantastic source, and that's Paul. And that's because he was a non-Christian. He was a non-believer who was not sympathetic or just neutral. He was so biased against the Christians that he was arresting them, he was imprisoning them, and consenting to their executions for being Christian. And then all of a sudden he became one because he said the risen Jesus appeared to him, and he became Christianity's most aggressive and perhaps most effective advocate. So that's a really good source that we have with Paul.
So we certainly shouldn't discount the New Testament documents themselves as honestly the best sources, because with history we want to, typically strongly earliest is best, and so if we treat...
and they do contain some eyewitness testimony. And if you're going to say, well, we can't include the Gospels because they were Christians, then you're going to have to turn around and say you're not going to allow an African American to write on the American Civil War, slavery in the American Civil War, because they're biased. We're not going to allow a Jewish historian to write on the Holocaust because they're biased. And of course, the Jewish historian and the African American historian may be the very best to write on it because they are interested. Precisely because they're interested, they will delve into it more deeply, make sure the facts are more accurate than what we would have from Gentile or Caucasian historians. And the same could be said of the Gospels and the New Testament literature. If these are written, some by eyewitnesses and others getting their information from eyewitnesses, that's pretty good stuff. And it's better than what we have for a lot of the ancient literature.
Yeah, we've got a lot of folks chiming in here. What appears to be on YouTube here. Barry brings up this concept of certainty, and maybe we'll touch on this. Barry says, you will always have doubts. Certainty does not exist. God wants you to trust him. Maybe for you guys, there are two different senses of certainty. Maybe there's like this absolute certainty, and maybe there's a reliable certainty. Can you guys talk about certainty?
Go ahead, Gary.
Quick comment. Years ago, I did an article for a journal, and it was on the topic of certainty and probability and probability calculus, which is a very well-known mathematical way to figure out likelihoods. Nothing to do with Bayes' theorem, but I mean, it could be, but it's doing other things. And I found out at that time that here's an example. If you have three arguments for something, let's say three arguments for the resurrection, you go, what would three arguments look like? Well, you got Paul's testimony. You've got, I think, Galatians 1 and 2. But Bart Ehrman calls Galatians 1 and 2 one of the two strongest testimonies for the existence of Jesus. But if you had three different arguments, or three different arguments for the afterlife, or three different arguments for God's existence, three different arguments for reliability, whatever you want, if each of these arguments are independent, meaning if any one of them is true, and you only need one of the three to be true, and you would put the three probabilities very reliably at about 80%. People think they're higher, but if you'll say they're at least 80. 3 80s, where you only need one to be true, is more than 99. It's something like 99.8% reliable. And I think that what I wrote in this article was there's absolute apodictic certainty, and there is certainty with the way we talk about it every day. When we call our wives, we don't say, hey, I'm leaving here in a few minutes. I know there's a storm, but I'm going to try to beat it. Should be home in 10 minutes. She doesn't say, honey, your likelihood just dropped from 98% on a normal day to 74% because this storm is really serious. We don't think like that. We don't wonder if our food is poisoned. We live life according to probability. And that this example of 380 is only one has to be true. If that's true of God, reliability, New Testament, so on. And someone might say, well, what if the atheist wants to do that? Yep, that's great. Now, if you're an atheist, give me three arguments, 80 to 90%, because there's a 90% argument too. 2 90s equal about the same thing as 3 80s. I want to see some atheist arguments that are that high. I want to know what the atheist arguments are, because I don't think they have them. So that's just some practical thoughts. I think what we normally say is see you in 10 minutes is a normal way of talking. The person doesn't say to you, is that proof? Do you have proof of that? Someone just goes, well, I'll go up there right now and wait for you then, because they take it for granted. And I think that's normal conversational language. And yes, we have that in the New Testament. But let me address the other point real quickly too. What about faith? Is there faith on this? Well, we can be married. We can be we can trust our spouses with our lives, and yet faith counts too. I mean, Alvin Plantinga's made an incredible argument for properly basic truths, that all of us are born with a sense of God's existence. So I do think, I don't buy that argument. There's no room left for faith. That's baloney. You marry somebody when you know a lot about them, not when you know nothing about them. So when you know a lot of things about them, it's not a leap of faith, but it's not the absence of faith either. You say I do because you think it's about time we did something, and I'm trusting you. So I think the I do sentence, I do, and you're married, I think that's very close to what the Christian does when they trust Christ.
Let me play devil's advocate here, Gary. With God, though, we're not just talking about whether we're going to make it home or who we're going to spend the rest of our life with. We're talking about our eternal destinies. And so maybe we require that extreme high sense of certainty in whether God exists, for example.
Well, Kurt, let me ask you a question. Where are you going to find that? Can you be absolutely sure your wife will never let you down? Can she be sure you will never let her down? Everything in life, we don't have anything that's inductive, anything that's built up by data. For these three reasons, I think the Atlanta Braves are going to win the World Series, whatever. We make inductive arguments. Inductive arguments are always probabilistic arguments. Someone says, well, I'd rather have science on my side. Brilliant. That shows you haven't been listening or don't understand the field, because all scientific arguments are inductive. All scientific arguments are probabilistic. So the guy who says, yeah, that's great, you're not going to miss your meatloaf, I want to make sure I'm not going to be going to hell. Sorry, has not changed at all. You only have high likelihood at best. That is the human life. You have high likelihood at best. Therefore, apologetics is the study. How about this? This is not all it does. But what if you said the study of apologetics is getting those likelihoods as high as possible? Richard Swinburne is an example. Tim and Lydia McGrew did a technical article in the Blackwell, the Encyclopedia of Natural Theology. They both came to similar conclusions. Richard Swinburne starts with God only being about 50-50, only 50-50, and still comes up with a 97% likelihood for the resurrection. I think, if you're looking for figures, I think that's pretty trustworthy.
All right.
I'd only add to that, or just to emphasize one of the points Gary made. You're going to put your faith in something. There's no worldview for which you can have 100% certainty. No matter which worldview you choose, you're going to have to do so by faith. So why not go with the one for which the best evidence exists?
Good. Yeah. All right. We've got a number of questions and more questions rolling in. I see some questions from Doug Pine Creek, which we'll put off for now. I see he's doing his street epistemologist routine here. All right. So we have a question come in about the authenticity of Pauline letters. So I'm not sure which one of you might want to take that, but there are the disputed. Of course, some of them are not disputed, and maybe some of them, being the most important ones from the minimal facts argument, are undisputed.
Yeah, I can go with that one.
Yeah, take it. I was just going to say I would normally jump to that question, but now Mike's here, and that's his field, New Testament. So he's the man.
So there's 13 letters in the New Testament that are attributed to Paul, and of those, all scholars will be in agreement that at least 7 of those have been written by Paul. There are 6 that are in dispute. You have the pastoral letters, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus. Then you have Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians. Now, but virtually 100% will agree on the other 7 that Paul wrote those. And what's nice about what Gary has done is he bases his minimal facts argument on the resurrection just within those 7 letters. So there's no case for the resurrection stands or falls on these other 6 letters. That is the resurrection, okay? And when we're talking about whether Christianity is true, if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity is true, period. And that would be the case even if Paul didn't write those 6 letters that don't have nearly unanimous consent from scholars. Now, of the other six, Colossians is about 50-50, or maybe just slightly more scholars think that Paul wrote Colossians. Let's just call it 52%, but it's just a little more than 50%. When it comes to Second Thessalonians, a slight majority of scholars do think that Paul wrote Second Thessalonians. So we're not talking about just evangelical scholars. I'm saying a slight majority of scholars say Paul wrote Colossians and Second Thessalonians. They just don't have the sort of agreement that the other seven do. So that would leave Ephesians, and it would leave the pastoral letters. Now, I have studied the arguments for the Pauline authorship of Ephesians, and frankly, I'm convinced of Pauline authorship. I don't think that the arguments against Pauline authorship for Ephesians are convincing. The number one argument that is given against the Pauline authorship of Ephesians is that certain words or phrases that are used by Paul in Ephesians are unique or different than what he uses elsewhere. So, for example, I think it's like the phrase entois uranois, for in the heavenlies. It's that one that he uses in Ephesians, or the others where it's en uranas, en tois, let's see. And anyway, there's a different form that it's used. And they say Paul uses one in his undisputed letters, but he uses this one in Ephesians. But, it was interesting. Several years ago, I was reading all the Pauline prison epistles in Greek 25 times, and I started to notice that Paul uses both of them in Ephesians, and he uses them at a certain kind of ratio. And if you take that and you go, I searched 2 Corinthians, and Paul uses both terms there with the same ratio he uses in Ephesians. And so if you're going to say if you're going to use that argument to say Paul did not write Ephesians, you have to likewise apply it to 2 Corinthians. And yet no scholar of whom I aware will say that Paul did not write 2 Corinthians. That's one of his undisputed letters. So I'm just unconvinced by the arguments against Pauline authorship of Ephesians. Now, when it comes to the pastoral epistles, I really haven't studied that, so I really can't answer that. However, I will say that even if Paul did not write them, that doesn't do anything to shake the case for Christianity, because if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true, period.
All right. By the way, when I do a minimal facts argument, Kurt, I tell people when I'm at state universities, I'm only going to use two passages from two of the six best accepted letters, and I would use 1 Corinthians 15 and the end of Galatians 1, beginning of Galatians 2, which in the original is one passage. You have just a few verses there at the end of Galatians 1, beginning of Galatians 2, and 1 Corinthians 15. Just those two texts alone, you can get these. In fact, as I said earlier, Bart Ehrman has a very interesting chapter in his book, Did Jesus Exist? And he has a chapter on two very prominent arguments for Jesus' existence. One of them is that he lists 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus, and that's key. The other argument is Paul visited Jerusalem and interviewed Peter and James about plus 5 years after the cross, but they're talking about things from earlier. And then, of course, in Galatians 2, a few years later, John is there. So the big four are there. And here we're back to the eyewitness testimony, but we're also back to all 7 epistles of Paul. Fantastic. You want to use just 2 of them? Great. Oh, you won't let me use the pastorals? Yeah, I never claimed it. I wasn't going to use that. All right, what do you need? Just 1 Corinthians 15, Galatians 1 to 2. I mean, it is a tough argument using just that minimal data from Paul.
So I do want to indulge Doug here. He's got a good question here this time around. He's loaded him up here. But this one pertains to using the minimal facts for religions other than Christianity, like Mormonism. So a couple of his questions are trying to compare that. Mike, you've written a short little book here on this. Would something like the minimal facts apply to Mormonism? If not, explain.
Yeah, I'd say let's go ahead and apply it to Mormonism. What about these the appearance of Moroni to Joseph Smith. Well, Joseph Smith was the only one claiming it. Others were claimed that Moroni appeared to him, but Joseph Smith was the only one who could say, well, Moroni appeared to him. Moroni did not appear to anyone else. So they were just basing their testimony on Smith's testimony. There was nothing to corroborate it. And then did Moroni actually appear to Joseph Smith? Smith said that Moroni told him about some golden tablets on the hill Cumorah up there in Palmyra, New York, just outside of Rochester, and that Smith claimed to go out and dig these up, and there they were right there. And this hill Cumorah would have been where the Book of Mormon says this ancient battle took place around the year 400. And the Book of Mormon says that hundreds of thousands died there, and they weren't buried. Their bodies were left to molder and return to Mother Earth. So the question is, well, if that really happened, we should find some skeletal remains, plenty of them. It's only 1,600 years since then. You should find some sort of artifacts and weapons, but nothing. They haven't found as much as a button on that hill. So plus the Book of Mormon says that the peoples who lived here in North America and Mesoamerica would have been in the millions, and that they spoke and wrote in Reformed Egyptian and Hebrew. But yet, if that were the case, we would expect to find some sort of carvings on rocks and things like that would have been in Egyptian or Hebrew, but we've not found anything like that. Plus, we would notice, if these claims were true, that there would be some sort of, since these people who would have migrated from Jerusalem in the year 600 BC to North America, there would be, because they would have mixed with the American Indians, there would be some Semitic DNA, but they've tested all the way from the top of North America all the way down to the bottom of South America for the indigenous folks, and they can't find any Semitic DNA. So there's just nothing to suggest. If we go with the minimal facts approach, everything goes against Smith's testimony that Moroni appeared to him. So you'd have to say, well, what are the minimal facts? We could say Smith claimed that Moroni appeared to him. That would be a minimal fact. Now, if your hypothesis then is Moroni appeared to him, then we would say, all right, well, let's assess that hypothesis. And we find that there's a naturalistic explanation that explains the data better than the hypothesis that Moroni actually appeared to Joseph Smith, the hypothesis being that Smith was either deluded or he lied. We come to the resurrection claims by the apostles. We apply the same thing. Hallucinations don't work. Lies don't work. Delusions don't work either. So it's not just the minimal facts. It's applying those with strictly controlled historical method, so taking the minimal facts, forming hypotheses, and subjecting them to historical method, inference to the best explanation.
So when we say, when we're looking at the disciples, and let's take Paul. So when Paul claims that Jesus appeared to him, that's something that we can look at and assess, and to see whether that proposition makes the best sense in the context. And
that's right.
What you're saying is that upon further analysis, the best conclusion is the fact that Jesus appeared to Paul. So that's a conclusion based off of the data, yes?
Yes. Yeah, and it's not just, Paul, it's the disciples, and it's group of experiences. It's the conversion of Jesus's brother James, who had denied him apparently all the way up through Jesus' crucifixion, and then afterwards he becomes convinced that his brother is the Lord. I mean, come on. So, you put all these things together, you consider all the facts like that, and take those into consideration, these facts that Gary's talked about, his minimal facts, and you form hypotheses using those facts, and then you weigh those hypotheses to see which one's the best explanation.
All right, last follow-up here on Doug before we move on to some others. He says, well, we've got two options for Paul. He was either deluded or lied. I don't think the lying one works out very well for Paul. What motive would he have? That just seems like a very poor option there, Doug. What about deluded, though? Couldn't Paul have had this weird subjective experience?
Yeah, why don't you go for that, Gary?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just say, for the sake of the argument, I tell audiences all the time. Told a PhD course last week, the students in the PhD course, I think the best thing Paul brings to the table is not necessarily his appearance on the road to Damascus. Now, even there, yes, there's differences about who saw what, but people saw things. I mean, notice all of them. Everybody fell to the ground from this light. There's other data there, but I don't think the best evidence for Paul is what happened, what he saw on the way to Damascus. I think Paul is at his best to know that, let me work this little 5-year slot out from crucifixion to Paul's trip to Jerusalem. Makes no difference whether Jesus was crucified in 30 or 33. The difference is going to be 5 years, approximately. Paul is converted at approximately 1 to 2 years after the cross. 3 years later is in Jerusalem. Let's just say 5. In 5 years, he spends 15 days with Peter and James. He goes back at about 48 AD, which is going to be, depending on when you think the cross is, just a short time. It's before the very first New Testament book is written. Before 1 Thessalonians is written, he's back in Jerusalem. The first time, Peter and James are there. Second time, Peter, James, and now John is there. When you put Paul into it, I mean, I teasingly tell people when you go to a big conference, you've got the plenary speakers and you've got the breakout speakers. Paul, Peter, James, and John are plenary speakers. Barnabas and Titus are big names, but they're breakouts. They're breakout speakers. You got the top 4 guys here in all of Christian history. Best historians. Paul's probably the best known missionary. All of this. And the point is, it's multiple attestation of witnesses. It's not just Paul's testimony, not just James's testimony, most likely an unbeliever before he met the risen Jesus, not just Peter and John's testimony. And in these cases, by the way, all of those names we just mentioned, with the possible exception of John, we have first century testimony for the martyrdom of the other 3. First century testimony. Now, if these folks are dying for what they believe to be true, the most likely explanation is, bingo, they really believed it. And we would apply that same reasoning to a Muslim who dies in the mission field, an atheist communist who dies on the mission field, so to speak. People can give their lives mostly for political or religious causes. And here's what we concede. Wow, I thought they were right. I didn't think they were right. Whatever my conclusion is, they were honest people. They died for what they believed to be correct. And when you bring together this foursome of Paul, Peter, James, and John, plus you have the backup from the Gospels. You know what? When we answered the other sources outside the New Testament question, when Mike answered it a little bit earlier, I thought to myself, critics think that there are sources behind each of the 4 Gospels. For example, there may be a pre-Markan narrative on the death of Jesus and up to the empty tomb. John is believed by critics, even the Jesus Seminar, John is believed to have a miracles source behind him. Luke says he checked the sources. So in every one of these cases, oh, by the way, I'll just add that pre-Markan Passion narrative, critics often say it must be before 37 AD. Now, I can't develop why that is, the argument, but it's very, very early. Now, if you put all these together, we have a plethora of sources, and they all say the same thing. How do you know they say the same thing? Because in Galatians chapter 2, when Paul returns and gives the gospel, he says, I set before them the gospel I preached. You won't find a definition of the gospel in the New Testament doesn't require the resurrection of Jesus. They all agreed. How do you know? Because just a few verses later, Paul said that they added nothing to my word. And a few verses later, they gave the right hand of fellowship. They laid hands on Paul and Barnabas. Then in 1 Corinthians 15:11, very important comment, after the early creed, Paul says, whether it is I or them, so we preach, and so you believe. Whether it's I or them, we preach this, you believe it. It's not just one testimony. all these people who are willing to die, which means they really believed it. They're all spread out now around the Mediterranean. The gospel sources have pre-sources that can go back possibly to 30s AD. Bart Ehrman says that the earliest creedal testimony, he says most of the early creeds, this is outstanding, he says most of the creeds were probably in existence by 33 AD, and most of them originated in Jerusalem. Now, just that's like 2 and 2 equals what? You know, most of the creeds are from Jerusalem, and they were in existence while Paul was persecuting the church. This is so much. We have way more sources than we need. And the key is on the gospel, the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, they all taught the same thing. Fraud, there's no possible way. There's too many sources spread around the Mediterranean. They're all dying for the same reasons, and it's always the deity, death, resurrection. Fraud dies 1,000 times over.
Yeah, I'd like to throw in something about the delusion thing, too. So if one wants to claim that Paul was deluded, well, they're going to have to provide some evidence for that. I mean, they're expecting evidence from us, so let's have some evidence that he was deluded. And then you're going to have to, if you give that, well, a hypothesis for that, now you've got to explain some of those other minimal facts, such as why you've got, several people who claim of the Jesus disciples who claim to be eyewitnesses. And then you've got to explain, and they really believed it. And then you've got to explain the group appearances as well and come up with a hypothesis for that. What you end up doing is coming up with a very complex hypothesis, a combination hypothesis. Paul was deluded, Peter hallucinated, he convinced the others. You get group hallucinations, which are rare, extremely rare, if not impossible. But this is just the case that they happen not once, twice, but 3 times. So it's extremely ad hoc, implausible when you come up with this combination hypothesis. So it's not just accounting for Paul. When you're doing proper historical investigation, your hypothesis has to account for all of the facts, not just one of them.
Kurt, if I could add one thing. Mike and I have made a big deal of this minimal facts argument for God. And we're not the only ones to do it. But a lot of people have adapted this minimal facts argument. I'm doing a huge magnum opus right now, and I'm somewhat over page 4,500. But a little while back, just very short time ago, I was counting all of the little bits of information that we have to back up just what I'm using in this multiple this big magnum opus is 6 minimal facts, 6. And I counted how many strands of decent data do we have backing up those 6 facts. You know why virtually nobody questions any of them? My list is over 100 pieces of information that confirm those 6. That's why when I'm in dialogues, Mike, I'm sure gets it too. When we're in dialogues and we say to people, hey, here's my facts, what do you think? The guys usually don't argue against the 6 facts. And they want to come up with something ad hoc. And like Mike just said a minute ago, you want to come up with something ad hoc? You want to say Paul had a sunstroke on the way to Damascus? You want to say Paul's line? Wonderful. I've got 100 backups for my 6 facts. While I drink some coffee here, you go ahead and give me your backups for Paul had a sunstroke. And by the way, all my sources are 1st century. Could you please use, hey, I won't be tough on you. Can you give me 6 1st century sources for Paul having a sunstroke? Now, I'm just going to drink my coffee here and let you talk. Go ahead. I'd like to hear what comes next. We're asked to produce, and the other side does what ifs. That's their comeback.
Yeah.
So, all right, we do have one question. I believe this is from a Christian who had this question, but it's about the one of those ad hoc hypotheses, which is this position is embraced by some scholars, mind you, about the hallucination hypothesis. So Justin E. asks, if the disciples were to hallucinate, what would you expect would have happened and why?
Doc, I can answer that, but why don't you take it?
Let me take it from what Mike said just a minute ago. Mike led us right up to this point, and Mike said, hallucinations just normally, there are studies out there. how likely is it for a person who does not have psychotic or a drug habit or they're mentally ill in other ways, what's the likelihood that the majority of people that live are going to have hallucinations? It's not even good to start with. But when you start introducing things like, let's say group hallucinations is going to be the toughest one. Like Mike said, I think he made a great point. They could very well be impossible. A good friend of mine, Gary Sipsey, clinical psychologist, did a lit review in psychology. Another good friend with whom I did an article on Jesus a few years ago, Joe Bergeron, a medical doctor, he did a lit review with medical sources going back, in each case, at least 25 years. Both of them reported there is not a single attested case of group hallucination on record. Okay, now, if we only needed one, and let's say our biggest argument was the 500, and if somebody could say, well, that's only one, I wouldn't hang my hat on one. But we have 3 group appearances in the short list in 1 Corinthians 15, probably the earliest list for resurrection, but 3 group appearances. Now, if you let me bring in the Gospels, even as backup, and then, of course, we have backup sources for each of the Gospels, like the pre-Mark and Passion narrative and so on. We have more group appearances, not a Mark, but we have post-crucifixion appearances for Jesus in the Gospels. And Mark, although he doesn't have them, he predicts them. He predicts an appearance to all the disciples in Galilee. So we have backups there. We have more than 3. The Jesus Seminar, who, doesn't respond well to real conservative Christianity, but when they in their colors, with red being yes and pink being probably, they give Paul saying, I saw the risen Jesus, is a red rating. Peter, where Paul's quoting the creed that Peter saw Jesus, they gave that pink because Peter didn't say it, but it came from a trustworthy source, Paul. So Paul's a red, Peter's a pink, and then they add in their footnotes, as does Helmut Kirster in his 2-volume New Testament intro. They both say, Jesus Seminar and Kirster both say, we must add the women. The women are another group. So we've got more than we need. So you're telling me you have no recorded group hallucinations in psychology or medicine. We have several in the New Testament, and then you're going to argue the big argument. You're going to tell me there's only 5 or 6 known in the world, and every single time it happened to the risen Jesus. I'm starting to call that a miracle. So, by the way, I just finished my chapter on hallucination, and I have 25 refutations. This is not a short story, and in no refutation did I use anything but the minimal data. I did not assume inspiration. I did not assume reliability. So, once again, there's a reason why critics today are saying, I don't want to pick a naturalistic theory. As a critic told me one time in a debate, an atheist told me one time in a debate, I don't want to pick a theory. And I said, well, come on, you're an atheist. You should have one on the tip of your tongue. What's your theory? So he picked one. And I was all ready to praise the Lord. The theory he picked was the dumbest thing in the world. He said the disciples stole the body. And as I began talking, he said, he was angry. And he said, Habermas, you've got me in a corner, and I don't like it. As far as I'm concerned, we're done describing this question. We're not talking about this anymore. And I said, well, I think that's pretty clear. I think critics don't want to pick a naturalistic theory because it immediately gets them in the corner. Take it from the atheist who just made that comment. They're uncomfortable picking naturalistic theory. You know what the byword is today? Richard Carrier, Bart Ehrman. Here's what they say. I'll pick any of them. All of them are better than resurrection. You know what that means? That means they don't have one they can pick.
With hallucination theory, the way I've always understood this was, well, if I'm seeing the pink elephant in the room, then you also have to be seeing the pink elephant in the room. And to the best of my knowledge, there is no documented case of that sort of experience occurring. It requires a referent in the mystical delusion or in the hallucination, literally. And so if some referent in the objective world to be there, it's more likely to be the case that there's something spiritual actually happening than for some hallucination to be occurring.
Another thing about hallucinations, if you look at the literature written on it, like as far as I know, the most comprehensive of recent by Ehlmann and Larraï in the hallucinations, what is hallucinations? I forgot. Gary might remember the title. It's published by the American Psychological Association. And basically they say that the group most likely to experience a hallucination are senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. But even then, only 7% of them experience visual hallucinations of their loved one. And with the disciples, he appeared to the 12. He appeared to all the apostles. So, I mean, you're looking at not 7%, but an unthinkable 100%. So that militates against hallucinations. The group experiences militate against hallucinations. That Paul, he would have been the last person to think Jesus rose from the dead. He's persecuting the Christians. That militates against it. Hallucinations don't lead one to the belief that a person has been raised physically and their grave is empty. You know, you might hallucinate them in the room in a spirit form, but it doesn't lead to the belief in a bodily resurrection. So there are so many different arguments, like Gary said, against hallucinations. It's one of the weakest hypotheses out there.
Let's take a non-naturalistic. Well, it depends on how you define the naturalistic explanation, but something that's becoming more common is that it's legendary material. And so Chris here is tuning in. He writes, it's a legend that's simple. Well, so you've got the mythicist crowd, and I'm not talking about that, though. I'm talking about sort of the development of the theological Christian community. And so Jesus's teachings and even actions develop later throughout the community's time together. So, you know, this is stuff of the legends. It's King Arthur, right? Not much different than that. Gary, what would you say to the legendary hypothesis?
Well, the book that Mike and I wrote together, and Mike wrote the majority of it, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, I think we handle three different kinds of legend theories. Legend theories from the old mystery gods who nobody argues that Isis Osiris lived. Then you've got people who lived and talked in history, Sabbatai Sevi, Apollonius of Tyana. They didn't even rise from the dead, but you don't have historical evidence anyway. And maybe the third one is the kind you're talking about. They say that stories get bigger as you go through the Gospels. Now, strangely enough, the data in the New Testament actually go against that third one pretty clearly. I mean, what are you going to say if you think the story gets bigger? I mean, could you imagine being a critic and going, for crying out loud, in the earliest Gospel, there's one angel. In the next Gospel, Matthew, there's one. But Luke has two. And by the time we get to John, there's two. I go, well, golly, that's not a story getting very big. Over 65 years, John has, he's got an extra angel there. But if you go to the Gospel of Peter, where everybody's coming out of the city and they're camping there, and the Jewish priests are all there, and there's like a cohort of Roman soldiers, and Jesus comes out of the tomb and he's like a superhero. His head goes up above the clouds. That's legend, and it spreads. But you don't see this kind of thing in the New Testament. But still, even so, I would go back to this. Many years ago, the famous theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg in Germany made a comment about legend theory. And he said this. He said, no matter what you get a legend to be, the story goes on and on and on and on. He says, let's just use what we know about the resurrection from the very beginning. And I would jump away at that point and say, let's just go to Bart Ehrman's testimony. Bart Ehrman, again, says most of the creeds are from the first 3 years. They're from Jerusalem. They probably emanated from the apostles or their immediate followers, and we have them at a very early date, and they can be tracked down. Bart Ehrman lists about a half dozen sources that he dates 1 to 2 years after the cross. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I tell people all the time, do not say that's too long for a legend to form. Legends can form in seconds. I can walk away from this broadcast, misrepresent something Kurt, you or Mike say, and I could get a legend going right there. It can be fast. But what I mean is, Bart Ehrman even says most of these creeds are 1 to 2 years after from Jerusalem. There's nothing like this in the world of religions. You guys have done this too. I've studied other religions. No religion can stand toe-to-toe and say, I've got empirical data. Ed Yamauchi says that Christianity is the only religion of which we have stories of Jesus, the founder, doing miracles within a generation. It's a great foundation for what we have. So at every single turn, the legend theory is slapped down by the minimal data that we know.
All right,
let me add a little bit to that. So you've got, let's bracket the Gospels, the resurrection narratives in the Gospels, bracket any discussion pertaining to whether, you see some legendary accretion that's going on there. I don't think that there is, but let's just bracket that for a moment. We can, just to bring back the conversation into perspective for doubters, is even if there is some legendary accretion that is going on in the resurrection narratives, it does not do a thing to the historical case for Jesus's resurrection. Jesus still rose from the dead. We can get this based on a minimal facts approach. We get back to these arguments that Gary uses, that I'll use, about how you've got eyewitness testimony. Paul's given eyewitness testimony. Paul knows the Jerusalem apostles, Peter, James, and John. They've certified that what he's preaching is what they're preaching, and the resurrection was at the center of that preaching. So even if over time, or by the time you got to the Gospels, that the narratives of the resurrection in the Gospels contain some sort of legendary increase, even if that were to be the case, we still know that Jesus's disciples are going around proclaiming the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. This is what they're saying. And so they're either lying about it or they really believe that that is the case. So you wouldn't be able to say legend. You can say hallucinations or deceit or delusion, whatever, but legend is not going to work. You still have resurrection at the very earliest time of Christianity. One last thing. We wouldn't say that resurrection was meant in anything other than a literal historical sense. You look at Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 15, and the Corinthians Christians are saying, hey, there's some people out here saying that this life is all there is. There's no afterlife, and there's no resurrection for you to expect. So just forget about this life is all there is. And Paul, so they're asking Paul, they say, so if this is if there's a resurrection, what kind of body are we going to come with? And so Paul starts to talk more about resurrection, the whole chapter 15. And his basic argument is this. If Christ has not been raised from the dead, we're not going to be raised from the dead. And if we're not going to be raised from the dead, the Christian life is not worth living. But then he goes on to say, but Christ has been raised, therefore we will be raised, therefore the Christian life is worth living. That argument makes no sense whatsoever if Paul did not mean for us to say, if Paul was not saying that Jesus had been raised in a historical, literal sense. And he's preaching the same thing as the Jerusalem apostles. So they were preaching Jesus rose at the earliest point, and that they really meant that he rose in a historical sense.
Mike, let me press you on this, and sometimes I've maybe given you a challenge here and there in our friendship. All right, so you've got certainly on your view, and Gary, I don't know what your view is on the raising of the saints, end of Matthew. Isn't this legendary, or what's the difference between legendary and apocalyptic in your mind, Mike?
Well, in terms of the saints raised at Jesus' death in Matthew 27, I think that what you probably have here are portents. That it's the same thing that we find Josephus using when he's describing events leading up to the temple's destruction in the year 70, that there was a comet, that the fighting was seen in the heavens, that the doors to the temple, which took more than 20 men to opened by themselves, that a cow gave birth to a lamb, that voices were heard within the temple that said, we are now leaving this place. It's the same kind of stuff we read Virgil in a poetic language when he talks about Caesar's assassination. Mount Etna erupted, there was a comet, fighting was seen in the heavens, pale phantoms were seen walking around at sunset. Black intestines were seen outside of cattle. There was darkness. Streams stopped flowing. Cassius Dio, when he talks about Caesar, and I think Caesar enslaving Egypt or one of those things, he talks about how the doors to the temple of Zeus, which took many men to opened by themselves, that ghosts were seen, that a woman with snakes as hair, a horrific sight, was seen walking around the city and terrifying. So, and an eclipse, all this kind of stuff. I think it's somewhat similar to today when we might say 9/11 was an earth-shaking event. We're not meaning to communicate. There was a huge earthquake felt around the world at that time. It is rhetoric. And these portents, which we don't normally really use today, these were common in the Jewish literature, in the Greco-Roman literature. We even find them in some of the Christian literature. So I think that that's what's going on with Matthew. I wouldn't consider it legend. I just think that he's writing these as portents to tell us that something of huge, cosmic, even divine significance has occurred with the death of the Son of God.
All right, we have a question here on cognitive dissonance theory from Matthew H. He writes, "The more I learn about cognitive dissonance theory and its relevance to apocalyptic movements throughout recorded history, the more inclined I am to think that it explains how Christianity began and why it took the shape that it did. Can you explain why the shoe doesn't fit in this case?"
Yeah, let me jump in on that one. Cognitive dissonance was at its heyday about, let me stop here and count real fast, about 60 years ago. And the guy most famous for this is a fellow named Fessinger. And his key example, when anybody writes on cognitive dissonance, their famous case is when the Seventh-day Adventists sold all their possessions and dressed in white and went out to wait for the coming of the Lord. What was it? Was that 1844? I'm trying to remember. Went out to the hill, and they waited and waited. They sold everything. They have nothing left to go home to. No home, no food, nothing to go back to. They waited there, and Jesus never came. Well, they didn't walk away and say, this is totally untrue. They just went back and said, well, obviously we figured wrong. And they refigured, and they got a different date for Jesus' coming. And probably fewer people than the first time, because some people are skeptical. But they went out and did the same thing. They got ready for his coming. He never came again. Fessinger's point, I think, is that sometimes when people are grossly disappointed, they don't leave, they double down. And cognitive dissonance is a doubling down theory. But to me, I don't think cognitive dissonance has anything to say about resurrection at all. You might say, oh, well, that's 70 AD and things didn't happen. You've got those who said Jesus already came. He was talking about apocalyptic signs, and those who said he was coming physically, and those people might be bothered. But this doesn't have anything to say. I mean, what I mean is, in Christian circles, you might have different views of eschatology warring with each other with this. But it doesn't say anything about, Paul didn't retreat and Jesus failed him, so he went back and became a rabbi again, or anything like this. They were all convinced till the day they died, not just that Jesus appeared. It's the same thing we've already outlined here for the last more than an hour. Jesus appeared. They have the data. They weren't running from anything. Nothing was disproven. Whenever somebody held a sword to one of their necks, we're talking metaphorically, when someone held a sword to their neck, they said, kill me. Paul says both in 2 Corinthians 5 and Philippians 1. These are both accepted Pauline epistles. Paul says, I prefer to die and be with Christ. I'd much rather be with Jesus right now. That's not running away from anything. Life is much worse if he stays. I don't see how cognitive dissonance applies to the resurrection. You might make it apply to something else. Some Christian sometime was disappointed because God was supposed to have done this and he didn't do it. Even in our lifetimes, there have been all kinds of predictions, even in spite of, we're not supposed to pick dates. People pick dates and things don't happen. I remember, I think of that comet at the end of late 1970s. I think of Y2K. There have been a lot of things that didn't happen. Apply it there if you want to, but it doesn't even make sense to apply it to resurrection because we have the best case for resurrection. Nothing's been explained away. Hey, listen, here's an example. If they found the bones of Jesus, maybe that's a case for Fessinger's theory. Because now what do you do? Oh, I don't know. I still believe, me and my house, we're still going to believe in the Lord. Nothing like that happened. The case for the resurrection remained equally strong. So wherever you apply Fessinger, it's not to the resurrection. I guess that's my bottom line.
And cognitive dissonance wouldn't account for the conversion of Paul, right?
Paul, James, the fact that they, as far as we know, let's put it this way. When I'm making an argument for the disciples, I don't say they all went to their deaths because you can't prove that. Right. But of the big four, we have 3 first-century reports, and a lot of, for Paul, Peter, and James. A lot of people assume John was never martyred, but they're surprised when you find out we have a 2nd-century source that may be legit for the martyrdom of John. So the big four could have been martyred. But beyond that, I tell people, don't die on that hill of the disciples all died for their faith. Everybody concedes. John Shelby Spong, everybody concedes. The disciples were willing to die at many times throughout their life. In other words, they were willing to die over and over. Remember the list that Paul gives? This happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me. I just don't see Fessinger having anything to say to this because the tomb was empty. There were appearances. There were groups. It happened many times over. We have way more sources than we need. And by the way, Richard Swinburne says that if you're going to do Bayes' theorem and work out that 97% for the resurrection, it's not just the evidence for the resurrection. Jesus is not John Doe. What do you have for Jesus before the resurrection? He's the only person in history who has any founder of a world religion who has miracles reported in a generation. You guys know he's the only founder of a major world religion who claimed to be God. The only one. He predicted his resurrection ahead of time. Mike's got probably the best treatment of that, both in his dissertation and in an article in the Journal for the Study of Historical Jesus. It's one thing to rise from the dead. It's another thing to tell everybody you were going to do this really improbable thing before it happened. What do you do with the Shroud of Turin? That at least deserves some questions. So with Jesus, you have the most unique person who ever lived many times over. And then what happens to him? Bingo. He's the one who rises from the dead. Everything is in our favor. We don't have to apologize. Nothing's been disproven. Everything is in our corner.
Yep. The reason I bring up Paul, though, is he wouldn't be guilty of cognitive dissonance because he wasn't hoping Christianity to be true and then worked to seeing it, try to work out something in his mind to make it true for him.
Sure.
He was persecuting the Christians. He would not have wanted it to be true.
Same with James.
Yeah.
That's great.
All right.
No, I'm just saying Fessinger can be used somewhere else, but not here.
We had a question come in about Dale Allison and his view of the resurrection. Perhaps you guys could first tell us what that view is and then why you think it's mistaken.
Let me say one thing, and then okay. I was just going to say, let me say one sentence, and Mike could take over because Mike spent a lot of time on this. The last time I was with Dale, he was here in Lynchburg. We sat down to talk, he and I and a mutual friend, and I got some coffee, and I went over to the table, and I sat down, and I gave the guys the coffee, and we started to talk. And I started the sentence before I even sat down at the table. I said, Dale, let me tell you my favorite sentence in your big book on the resurrection. And he was wondering what I'm going to come up with. And I said, here's the sentence. I said, after saying you're a deist, after you said I'm a, quote, cryptic deist, I said, my sentence, this is pretty close to quote. I said, my favorite sentence is when you say, after Jesus died by crucifixion, I have no doubt that Jesus appeared to his disciples. Now, that's a one-liner bottom view, and Dale said he has no doubt about it. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, Dale Allison's one of my favorite New Testament scholars. He's not a conservative. For those of you who don't know who he is, he teaches at Princeton. He's been around a long time. He's just a great guy. Night Comes is a book that he recently wrote, and he's talking about death, and it's a fantastic book. As a conservative, I don't agree with everything Dale says or his thoughts on things, but Of course, I don't agree with everything a lot of my conservative friends say either, but I think he's a fantastic New Testament scholar. His book, he'll acknowledge that his view of resurrection in his book, Resurrection, is a little confusing, that he presents it in a little bit of a confusing manner. But I've spoken with him. In fact, I present his view in the appendix of my large resurrection book. He believes Jesus rose physically from the dead and leaving behind an empty tomb. Now, he's not sure of the nature of the appearances. I think he thinks that, if I recall correctly, that Jesus appeared to them in visions. And maybe Gary can speak to that, but I know that he believes that Jesus rose physically from the dead, leaving behind an empty tomb. But I do compare his view with the view that Jesus was raised bodily, the appearances were bodily, in the back of my book.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. Dale also says that there's no question that the New Testament view is that the New Testament writers believed Jesus appeared physically, that there was a body. And so if you ask him, he even says a couple places in the book, whatever my view is, he says they believe, Paul believed, the disciples believed Jesus appeared physically. So he thinks that is the Jewish view. And by the way, Dale believes in the resurrection, but there are a growing number of non-Christian, let's put it this way, non-Orthodox New Testament scholars who think that the appearances, they don't even believe the appearances, but they believe that the New Testament teaches they were bodily. So that view was not in 30 years ago. And because of Tom Wright, because of, come on, Mike, the book, the article on Soma and Death and Resurrection by Gundry, Bob Gundry. And Mike in his big book on the resurrection, starting on page 400, I just looked it up, starting on page 400.
400 is nothing compared to 4,500.
No, but Mike's section on this starts on page 400, and he's got a fantastic defense of a lot of good verses. Like one of his favorites is Romans 8:11, and very few people make anything special of Romans 8:11. But Mike does an excellent job on bodily appearances. And back to Dale Allison, what I was saying was, Dale says it's pretty clear that that is the New Testament view, and that's the view that Mike and Bob Gundry and N.T. Wright are all defending this bodily resurrection thing. And I think it's probably the majority view today that the New Testament Christians believe Jesus appeared to them bodily. And somehow you have to explain the empty tomb, like Mike said.
Let me ask you guys this question. It's for both of you. And then we'll take just a short break, just a 90-second stretch. If you guys had to say what you think is the best argument against the resurrection, what would that argument be?
Okay. Mike, you can go if you want.
Sure.
All right, I'll start with mine.
I think all naturalistic explanations just come up short. So I think the best would be to say there's just not enough evidence to convince me.
All right.
Right. And you know what? If a guy said, I get that a lot, but if a person said that, I would say, according to psychological surveys, most doubt is emotional. And if 70 to 80% of doubt is emotional and you don't like the evidences for, that probably is a commentary on the fact that you wouldn't believe no matter what, because your rejection is most likely an emotional rejection, and so it's not grounded. I would just say that to the guy and see what he says. But if I get asked this a fair amount in interviews, and I would say the best comeback to the resurrection, like Mike, I wouldn't take a naturalistic theory, because like that atheist I told you about earlier, I wouldn't want to get fried in the corner for picking one view and have this guy pummel me with the evidence. So I'm not going with the naturalistic theory. I would say the number one comeback is, here's your guy's problem. No matter how good your evidence is, you want me to believe there's another world. And science is clear that there's no Middle Earth, there's no Narnia, there's no Oz, and there's no wizard who lives in that city. So The problem is your view is way more ad hoc and way more complicated than mine because you assume another world. And that's why I know Mike does this in his own way. But that's why I stop at that point in a dialogue and I'll say, hey, look, there's a lot of ways to get to Oz or Middle Earth or to Narnia. And I'll say, look, we've got these arguments for God. We've got these arguments for miracles, not just that Jesus is a miracle worker and that almost everybody acknowledges that he did those healings. Then today, people like Craig Keener and several other books on miracles with pre and post MRIs, CAT scans, and X-rays. All this argues for another world. But my favorite one is near-death experiences. And I think near-death experiences open up the other world because they're evidence. So that's my going after the best response. But I think most Christians are not ready for a how do you get Narnia? You need Narnia for a resurrection, and everybody in science agrees there's no Narnia. What do you say? Well, I give an argument for Narnia, and if you held me to one, I'd take the near-death experiences.
So you've got your arguments for Narnia, as you say, and then you could also look at it the other way and say, well, sort of from a negative argument against that philosophical assumption. I mean, a few assumptions there. That. How do we even know the truths that the scientific field takes for granted? I mean, how do we know those exist? And you could just keep playing that card.
Sure.
Or on what Mike said was the good argument. There's just not enough evidence. Well, okay, if you're gonna hold and abide by that standard, then just push it further. Then there's all sorts of things you can't know about. And I'll give a shout out to this satire page on Facebook called A Lincolnism, and it just takes this to the extreme that there was no Lincoln. Lincoln didn't even exist. So this is what happens when you just take this extreme view, extreme skepticism, and just run with it. It just doesn't make sense of what we actually can know from history.
Kurt, if I can add one thing before you break, this just happened to me last week. I was teaching a PhD course, and this comment came up in class. What about Narnia? What about Middle Earth? What about Oz? And I said, same thing. We can go for God. We can go for miracles. We can go for indies. Mike has another category that he uses, and some friends who back this one up on paranormal things. But so in class, I said to them, as I did now, I said, my favorite one is near-death experiences. They go, oh, tell us about it. So I give them about 15 evidential cases, of which there are now over 300 evidential cases for NDEs. But here's the interesting thing, human nature. There's only 13 students in this room. And one of my students is a medical doctor. The guy has he has two specialties, anesthesiology and pain management. He's sitting there. He's not heard the NDE argument. And as we go to break, the students started walking up to me. They're getting ready to take a break. They're colleagues, but they come up. Only 13 people in the class. I had 4 NDEs in that class reported. And one of them was an Indian student with a master's degree in philosophy and a 4-year THM from Dallas. And the guy, when he was 14 years old, he fell 25 feet out of a tree and landed on his head. His head blew up. He bent over and he showed me the scar in his head. He was up above his body the whole time. He told me blow by blow what his mother said, what she was doing, what happened around him. He gave him this evidence, but he's out on the ground with no response. Another gal is it from a Middle Eastern country, and she was in a car accident and the car rolled 4 times. Okay. Later in the week, these two had this experience, and I said to you guys, hey, they were talking about religious experience. And I said, can I make fun of your 2 NDE experiences? Could I ever take those 2 NDE experiences away from you? They said, nope, you can't. What if I told you it's a bunch of bull? Yeah, that doesn't touch it. What if I told you it's an hallucination? No, hey, look, we got a medical doctor here. What if I could tell you it was this or that drug? Sorry, I was there. So you were in Narnia. I was in Narnia. You're not going to give that up. I won't give it up. 4 of them right in the room with only 13 people. So I think this other world is closer to us than we think it is. And thankfully, I think people are coming to see that. Unfortunately, they're going to Eastern views and things like that. But this dead naturalism just isn't around too much anymore, except in the universities.
Gentlemen, this has been fun thus far. We're about halfway there in our 3-hour live stream event, taking questions from doubters. And we've spent a lot of time here in the first half looking at sort of questions about the Gospels and New Testament. In the second half of the program, we'll have some of those, but we'll also have some questions going into some more theological questions, say problem of evil or historical Adam and Eve, those types of questions too. So I look forward, especially because maybe some of these questions you haven't addressed in your published works. I look forward to seeing what some of you guys say on that. So if you're just tuning in with us now, we're paying attention to the live stream feeds here. Would love to get your questions, but we're going to take a short 90-second break here. So watch this video from one of our sponsors here, Defenders Media.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Licona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill Podcast with Kurt Jaros, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. All right, thanks for tuning in with us through that break from our sponsor, Defenders Media. Well, if you want to learn more about the work of Defenders Media, it would be a great opportunity for me to tell you about that. If you've got a question, you want to learn, if you're an apologist and you want to learn more about what we do, you can just send me an email, Kurt, K-U-R-T, at defendersmedia.com. As you see there, one of our long-term ministry partners has been Mike Licona, and it's been a great honor to do some work on his behalf. And I'd love to learn more about your ministry if you're a young apologist or an experienced one as well, and you're looking for some media services. We also have different ways that we partner with ministries. For example, we do bookkeeping and consulting, of course, marketing consulting, in addition to sort of the traditional media services like websites, social media, graphic design. So I'd love the chance to tell you more about what we do here at Defenders Media. We're bringing this to you tonight, this 3-hour live stream event, looking at questions from doubters. And whether that's a non-Christian who has doubts about the Christian worldview, whether that's a Christian who's communicating doubts from others, or whether that's a Christian, him or herself, who has doubts. We've gotten sort of these 3 categories of different types of questions from doubters, and it's been wonderful to this evening to be joined by doctors Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. They've been longtime friends, both of them New Testament scholars, prolific authors. Chris, my technical producer, Chris, could you pass me Mike's book? I want to show people how big this book is by Mike. Just a huge, it was his doctoral dissertation. I've got a complete draft of my doctoral dissertation, but good night. This is a huge book that Dr. Licona has written, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. And I've given it a comb over so much that the binding is beginning to come apart, basically. But just a great book which lays the historical foundations for how we can know with a reliable certainty that it's as a historical fact that Jesus resurrected from the dead. It's just a great book here. And actually, I've got his most recent book down here to my left, because I just keep Mike's books within arm's reach. Why are there differences in the Gospels? What we can learn from ancient biography. And this is a great book, and a good plug for the upcoming Defenders Conference in Oak Brook, Illinois, on October 18 and 19, next month, just a few weeks away now. Is the annual Defenders Conference. And this year our theme is on gospel differences. We've invited 4 different speakers to present their views on why there are differences in the Gospels. 3 of them are evangelical Christians. One of them is one of Christianity's most enthusiastic critics, Dr. Bart Ehrman. Bart's been mentioned on our program here a couple times already. We've invited him to speak. So it's really going to be a fascinating event for those that want to get different views on why there are differences in the Gospels. Of course, some of them are very basic and simple. 1 angel at the tomb or 2. Some of them are a bit more complex, like how many times did Jesus cleanse the temple, 1 or 2? Well, in John, that occurs early in Jesus' ministry, but in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that occurs later. Or how did Judas die exactly? So there are all sorts of different questions and differences in the Gospels, many more than just the couple that I've mentioned here. And I want to encourage you to go to our website, thedefendersconference.com, to learn more information, and you can register there, and we'd love to see you in Oak Brook, Illinois on October 18 and 19. All right, well, let's get back to the questions now. So like I said, we've had 3 different categories of questions, and we've got people that have been tuning in here, watching along, some of them all the way through here, some devoted followers interacting, I guess, with each other. But let's look at some of the more emails that came in. Let's see here. So here's a question about something Jesus said in Matthew 24. So Mike and Gary, let's see here. This is from my pastor in British Columbia. His name is Rick. He says, one of the queries that gets thrown my way quite often, especially as we preach through the Gospels, is whether Jesus simply missed it when in Matthew 24, 34, and 35, he prophesied into the future, saying, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Rick says, the skeptics say, there, see, he was wrong, and that proves he was not who he said he was. Perhaps Dr. Habermas, let's see, he says, Rick says, maybe this question for you. What do you think Jesus was talking about? Was it his second coming, or was it 70 AD, or both? Generally, if we're confused about a text, I assume we're missing something. So what would you say to Rick here, Gary?
Well, actually, that question, a lot of folks know because I got the stories out there, but I spent 10 years questioning and was afraid at one time I was leaving the Christian faith. In fact, I told my mother I was pretty sure I was going to become a Buddhist. And that didn't happen when I was 12 years old. I already had a PhD when I said that. So that might raise some questions. But that was one of the issues that I was concerned about. So I went back and studied. And that particular, there are several of these comments in Jesus, but that is probably the most troublesome one. What kind of gets me about Matthew 24, the Mark is the earlier depiction of that. And in Mark 13:32, Jesus says, that day or hour knows no one, not the angels, not even the Son. So it's a Son of God saying, which is very valuable, but Jesus said he doesn't know the time of his coming. There is a British school of thought. There's a lot of answers I could give you, and tell me if you want more. But the most common from British New Testament scholars, there is a way of answering this, and it goes like this. Maybe this is why the pastor chose Matthew 24. In Matthew 24, it begins with the disciples and Jesus walking. They're near the temple, and they're going, beautiful building. And Jesus said, there'll come a day when not one stone is standing on the other one. And the disciples asked 2 questions. When will this happen, that the temple will be destroyed? And when will the time of your coming be? This British school of thought, which has a number of the most influential thinkers who take this view, F.F. Bruce and many, many others, take the view that Jesus, in the later verses of Matthew 24, he's answering those 2 questions. And his answer to the first question, when will not a stone be left on the temple, is when you see the armies come and so on, and that's 70 AD. That's a Jewish Roman war, 66 AD, culminates with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Jesus is saying, question one, not one stone on the other is going to happen in about 40 years. That's basically Jesus's. And on the second one, when are you coming? He says, I don't know. And Mark 13:32, that day or hour knows no one. This generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled, is referring to everything leading up to the temple. I've already told you, it's going to happen soon. Not one stone's going to be on top of the other, and you guys in this generation will live to see it. When am I coming? I don't even know. And in Acts chapter 1, when just before the ascension, the disciples, Jesus says, stay in Jerusalem till you see the Holy Spirit coming. And they say, oh, well, are you going to restore the kingdom to Jerusalem at this time? And he says, I've already told you. Acts 1:6. Nobody knows this. It's something the Father's put in his own power. So just, basically he says, mind your own business and get out there and, Acts 1:8, go into all the world and preach the gospel. So Jesus disavows twice that this is in his, his specialty. So here's the question. If Jesus says, I don't know when I'm returning, why would he say in the exact same context that this generation will not pass? One more problem. The way critics look at this, either way, you've got a big problem for your critic, and you're trying to make this objection. Are Matthew and Mark after the fall of Jerusalem or before? If they're after Jerusalem, did I say Matthew? If Matthew and Luke are after Jerusalem, like they almost unanimously put them there, why would Matthew and Luke record the false prophecy if that time had come and gone, the temple had been destroyed, and Jesus had not returned? Why would they reproduce this generation comment if they thought Jesus was a false prophet? It makes no sense, and it goes against all common sense. So now you're violating one of the biggest rules in higher criticism to say that they knew about this, and they just said, oh, well, he's a false prophet. Let's move on from here. So there's a couple of reasons why I think that I like that two-question approach. I'll give you several others. I found 8 responses that were very satisfactory when I was going through my doubt period on this time of Jesus' coming.
I would only add to that that even worst case scenario. I like Gary's answer. I just want to bring back the focus on resurrection. And that is worst case scenario, even if Jesus was wrong there, it doesn't do anything to undermine the evidence that he rose from the dead. And if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true, period.
Exactly. In fact, guys, Mike knows this. Hey, since you gave Mike's books out there, I'm going to push one of mine. No, I'm just kidding. In a book I wrote years ago, The Risen Jesus and Future Hope, I have a really long endnote on was Jesus wrong about the time of his coming. I give 8 responses, and one of them is this. The worst you can get from this question, the worst you can get, is that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. His Father raised him from the dead, backing up what he said, because the Father wouldn't raise a heretic from the dead. That's an impressive argument. But if Jesus turns out to be wrong about something, from the bottom of my heart, I don't think he was at all about the time of his coming. But if you have him wrong, and he just went off on a limb and, was feeling the power, and he made a prediction and it didn't happen, the worst you have is Jesus making what philosophers call a non-ethical blunder, a factual blunder. He's still the Son of God. God would have raised the Jesus who made the blunder because he's right in what he said about himself and about the plan of salvation, all because of the resurrection. That is just hands down the best comeback.
Yeah,
Mike,
it's not an all or nothing thing with Christianity. It's not like, we believe the Bible's divinely inspired. Christians around the world do. Okay, that's what I'm saying. And it's not an all or nothing thing that everything in the Bible has to be true or you can't believe any of it. You, as Gary and I do, but especially Gary over the years, shown about the historical case for Jesus's resurrection. It's really strong, and it is not contingent on the Bible being divinely inspired or even the Gospels being generally reliable. It's a matter of what are the known facts and what's the best explanation for those facts.
All right, let me push back a little bit if I can. But could Jesus have been wrong? And if he could have been wrong, then is he divine? So there you might get into issues of core Christian doctrine.
Yeah, I think there's a number. I mean, that is something over which theologians debate, right? A historian really can't talk about that, just because, from a viewpoint of a historian, there's no way that, we can prove that Jesus claimed. I think we can give a very strong case that Jesus claimed to be God's uniquely divine son, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds, that he interpreted as divine miracles and exorcisms, and that Jesus rose from the dead. If Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity's true. Jesus' claims about himself being God's uniquely divine son are true. But then that's about as far as we can go as historians. Then you say, well, could Jesus have been wrong on something? What would that mean? Well, Jesus was fully divine, but he was also fully human. And that human element changes things. There were occasions when Jesus, like Gary pointed out, he didn't know the time when he was coming back, right? So that human element changed something. So would it mean that he could have been wrong on something? I don't know. That's a question for theologians to talk about. All I'm just saying is that even if he were wrong, that wouldn't change the fact that he was, risen from the dead. Let's put it this way. You get to heaven, okay? You die, you're there in heaven, and Jesus meets you there, right? And you go, hey, this is so cool to see you. I'm so glad I was a follower of you, that you called me to yourself, because I know you're the only way. And what if Jesus said, well, yes, but, it's going to surprise you, but there are some non-Christians who are up here too, who were non-Christians there, and they died as non-Christians, and I gave them a second chance after they died. I talked to them. Maybe they never heard while there, and I gave them, would you be surprised? Maybe not so much. What if he said, well, I really didn't rise from the dead. In fact, I'm just one of many gods. Well, yeah, you'd be shocked, But what if he said to you, yeah, I just got it wrong with my timing of my second coming, or something? How shocked would you be? Well, you certainly wouldn't be as shocked as the other one, right? That there were many ways. So, there are things that are just of varying importance. I don't know. I'm not a theologian in that sense. So.
And there are other avenues one might take here. You could say, well, perhaps Matthew misrecollected. So you could say that there's if you think there's an error in the text, if you're open to that possibility, you could say here, hey, maybe this is a candidacy for an error if you think Jesus is trying to predict his second coming, which maybe he's not even trying to do, to begin with. So maybe we were just playing the wrong sort of game here.
That's right. There's only three options here. Number one, Jesus got it wrong. Or number two, the gospel authors got it wrong. Or number three, we've got it wrong, because there is an otherness to the past to us. There's a lot of things that we don't understand about some of the things that they say. I tend to think that it's us that are getting things wrong for a number of reasons, some of which Gary provided.
Yep. We've got here Dusty who comments. He's asking about legend. Dusty, I want to encourage you to go back to the first half of the program. We do address legend earlier this evening. Boy, man, some of the comments I'm having trouble keeping up with. Hopefully we'll get around to some of them. One came about, for Gary, if you could talk about verified miracles.
Verified miracles?
Yes. So I take it maybe this person's asking, like, are there eyewitnesses to miracles in present day, or testimonial experience, scientific support to miracle claims?
Okay, let me answer on two levels: Jesus and today. When I went to graduate school, Kurt, way back before you were a thought in your parents' mind, your parents probably weren't born. No, I went to graduate school in the early 70s, and if you had identified yourself as a believer that Jesus healed and did exorcisms, besides snickering, probably because this is the era of Rudolf Bultmann. Bultmann doesn't die till 76, and the New Testament world is still under his influence. And he says we can no longer believe in the New Testament world of demons and miracles because electric lights work. That is literally what Rudolf Bultmann says. But today, virtually every critic believes Jesus was raised from the dead. Marcus Borg, before his death, Marcus Borg said, I don't know what you think about miracles, his reader. I don't know what you think about miracles, but if you want to go on the historical argument alone, it is virtually impossible to deny that Jesus was a healer and an exorcist. And Borg says, here's some reasons why. I'll leave this to you guys to explain another broadcast, but critics often say there's 5 sources behind the Gospels, not 5 Gospels, but 5 sources behind the Gospels, behind the 4 Gospels. And Marcus Borg says, in those 5 sources, all 5 call Jesus a miracle worker. That's called multiple attestation. That is heavy data. When you have 5 out of 5 claim that Jesus is a miracle worker, that's one of Borg's. Borg says, here's number 2. The enemies who heard Jesus and saw Jesus do his miracles, they said, well, yeah, you're doing miracles, okay, but it's by the power of Satan. And so what's going on? That means Jesus did miracles. So according to 5 out of 5 sources, including the enemies who were present, Jesus was performing miracles. And today, I just read a critical New Testament scholar recently say, he said 100%. I mean, I think that's one of those, 99, 97 type things, but that we talked about earlier. But he said all scholars today concede that Jesus is a miracle worker. Okay, take that. And then secondly, you've got a guy like Craig Keith.
Hey, wait a minute, Doc, just so people know who Marcus Borg was.
He was a co-founder of the Jesus Seminar.
Yeah, not an evangelical.
Sorry?
Not an evangelical by any stretch.
No. He was a good friend of John Dominic Crossan's, co-founder of the Jesus Seminar, and a real skeptic. Wrote a book on how Jesus and Buddha are similar. So, and he says, I don't care what your beliefs are, it's virtually impossible to believe Jesus was to deny that he was a miracle worker. And you know what else Borg says? Borg goes, well, can you raise the dead? And Borg says, I don't know. He says, Jesus was an incredible guy. I am not prepared to tell you what Jesus could have done and what he couldn't do. And then he raises another question. What about the exorcisms? Because that's equally well evidenced. He says, well, and he gives this is Marcus Borg. He gives the results of a scientific study of 20, I believe it was 20 cases adjudicated by psychiatrists on whether persons X, Y, and Z, a whole list, were demon-possessed or having mental illness. And Marcus Borg says they could explain 18 of the 20 cases, and 2 of them, they said, something supernatural appears to be going on. And Borg goes, who am I to say? Jesus was a very big guy. So that's how he leaves it. And then enter Craig Keener, who has over 1,000 pages of hundreds of miracle claims today. Now, many of the things that Craig reports are anecdotal. A missionary told him that someone said something. Okay, so a lot of them are stories. But Craig collected a number of the people he interviewed sent him x-rays. He's got pre and post x-rays, pre and post CAT scans, pre and post MRIs of people who were healed with the condition before, condition after. And Craig Keener's not the only one who writes these books. I look over to my left here, and I have 2 books in my study on other authors who've done modern day miracles. So the things that Jesus did seemingly are being duplicated today by God's grace. That would be the beginning of a case, I think, for some of these evidential cases for the miracles of Jesus in particular, and miracles still happening today.
Aiden Peterson was asking about a question, and it's disappeared from my stream here. I think it was about Alter and his book on the resurrection. You guys, does that ring a bell?
Sure does. Go ahead, Mike. Mike just did some work on this recently.
Well, I listened to a debate he had with Jonathan McClatchy on Unbelievable. I don't remember some of the things that he said. I took notes. I mean, I could, if I had those notes before me, I could get those. But I mean, I thought his arguments were extremely weak. I mean, they were all softballs. The guy's not a historian. I mean, he just shows a complete lack of how to do history, and he's not a scholar. That shows in his writing. Well, I shouldn't say his writing, but it showed in that debate with Jonathan McClatchy. So, Doc, maybe you remember some of the things that he was saying. I don't remember right off. I don't have my notes on me that I wrote from that dialogue with McClatchy.
Yeah, I know Michael. I had lunch with him once and spent a little bit of time, and we correspond quite a bit. I will tell you this. His big thing, he's Jewish, and his big thing is noting discrepancies in the Gospels. But now I won't treat that specifically because we've treated it several times, and just tonight. To me, the question in Scripture is not how many errors are there in the New Testament, or are there errors in the New Testament. The question is, does that change anything? If in the ancient world we ruled out every historical source that has a problem, any source that has a problem, we wouldn't have any books in history. We wouldn't have any books today. So you have to ask yourself, why would this errors thing? The Bible is the Gospels are full of errors. Why would a Jewish, non-Christian Jewish resurrection scholar, Pinchas Lapid, say Jesus is raised from the dead? Why would another Oxford University historian, Jewish historian, Gezer Vermesh, he doesn't affirm the resurrection, but he says a lot of positive things, including that naturalistic theories don't work. Why would these guys, why would a Dale Allison, why would many critics say that, hey, something's going on here, the resurrection is looking good? They all know from their viewpoint that there are problem passages in the Gospels. Didn't stop these guys from saying the resurrection can't be disproven. Why not? Because nobody argues that if you have a problem, you rule out the resurrection as a result. So that approach is interesting, and it bothers a lot of Christians. And Christians are, with good reason, concerned about the gospel text, but it misses the resurrection by a mile. Because I'll say it this way, I often hold the Bible up like this when I'm lecturing on a college campus. And I'll say, if the Bible's inspired, Jesus has been raised from the dead. But if the Bible not only is not inspired, but if the Bible is unreliable, if the Gospels are unreliable, but the minimal facts are true, guess what? In this unreliable book, if that's the thesis you want to take, in your unreliable book, we have 6 facts that prove the resurrection. So I'll go from here going, man, I don't know about some of those claimed discrepancy cases, but I know Jesus was raised from the dead. And if you know Jesus is raised from the dead, as I like to tell people, you're on the yellow brick road, you're on your way to the Emerald City, keep moving, don't let anybody get you off the road, because the path is clear. So I think approaches that say it can't be true because they're errors are just totally missing the mark. Not because there are errors, but because that doesn't do anything to the facts we're using.
Yeah, I mean, you could just take the assassination of Julius Caesar. We find that in Appian, Cicero, Dio, Livy, Nicolaus, Plutarch, Suetonius, and Velleius. And yet they disagree on so many different peripheral details. But no one turns around and says, well, I guess no one assassinated Julius Caesar. They just say, well, there's various reasons to take into consideration why those differences exist. And even if some of the authors got some of it wrong, it doesn't change the ultimate conclusion. I mean, you have things like what did Caesar say to Casca after he stabbed him that first time? And where did Casca stab him? Was it in the neck or was it the shoulder? And things like this. And who was it that detained Antony outside of the theater? Was it Trebonius or was it Demarcus Brutus Albinus? And there, again, there's different ways of explaining these differences through compositional devices, actually. But even if you have errors, they're just in minor details. No one would even question even just some of the basic details of, all right, Caesar was assassinated, Brutus, Casca, and some of the other, Cassius were involved in this, that it happened on the Ides of March in 44 BC. It was in the morning, and it happened there where the Senate was convening in Rome at the time. So you still have all of those. That's the discrepancies at the very best within the gospel accounts. At the very most, it would call into question certain doctrines, a way of interpreting biblical inerrancy, but it wouldn't even really call into question the reliability of the accounts. Hey, I'm looking at some of these notes that I took from that exchange between Alter and McClatchy. And one thing Alter says, he says, well, are we to believe because these 12 fishermen claimed it? These were unlearned fishermen. Should we believe it? Well, suppose that we have an accident of a municipal bus, and we have the testimony of, this bus, this bus crashes into this building for some reason, okay? And then you've got this group of construction workers who witness it. They're right across the street. And all these construction workers are saying they saw what happened. Are we going to say that, oh, we can't believe them because they're just construction workers? I mean, isn't that just, it's a little ridiculous to say, well, these were just 12 fishermen. Well, what do you have to be? Do you have to be a Roman senator in order to be believed, as though, they're completely reliable? These are just, you have some crazy things that alter, like for Paul's conversions, he says, oh, that's not significant. He had never seen Jesus before. Well, how do we know that? I hear so many skeptics saying Paul never met Jesus before, saw him. Paul was out persecuting the Christians for a reason. He disagreed with the message of the Christians, and he was alive when Jesus was around. He's in Jerusalem at the same time with all the different festivals several times a year that Jesus was attending. Jesus is preaching publicly. He's doing the disturbances in the temple. He's there on trial before the Sanhedrin and before the Jewish leaders. Paul might have actually been at Jesus' trial. We don't know. But I think it's too much to claim he had never seen Jesus or met Jesus. He knew what Jesus was teaching, and that's why he was out to persecute him. He says that it was possible that Paul experienced an epileptic seizure. Yep. Well, what's your evidence for that? Because he saw a bright light. Okay, so you're going to take you're going to take the Acts account about Paul having a bright light. Well, the Acts account also talked that he had traveling companions. They saw the light and heard the voice as well. And are they all having epileptic seizures? Or are you just doing a cafeteria buffet style approach where you take only those details that you like and reject the rest? And we could go on, but all he does is he posits these psychoanalyses within fictional proposals, and really gives no evidence for them whatsoever. It's like like Gary said a little earlier, we can provide all this evidence, and all he can say is, well, what if? And he provides no evidence for it at all. That's not how history is done.
Kurt, if I could say something real quickly, just for our Christian listeners, Mike and I, when you do a minimal facts argument, you respond to a worst case scenario type deal. And we're saying, well, look, if for someone who thinks the Bible, when I was holding the Bible up, for somebody who thinks that the Bible's unreliable, we still got 6 facts that give us the gospel, that gets us on the yellow brick road, that gets us to heaven. We do a minimal facts. It's a heads I win, tails you lose argument. If this book is God's word, we're on our way to heaven. If this book is not good copy and it's unreliable, we're on our road to heaven. Bottom line, we're on the road to heaven. But for Christians who are bothered by us saying that, because they go, hey, you guys live in this stuff all the time, and these critics don't mean you don't stop because these guys don't make sense. You're used to dealing with them. They don't have any reasons. But I'm worried when I hear this stuff. There are some really good helps out there for them to put on their shelf. And I'm thinking about books like Gleason Archer's Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, Geisler and Howe's book on critics, big books with a lot of things. Oh, by the way, the Hard Sayings books published by InterVarsity. F.F. Bruce does the Hard Sayings of Jesus. Excellent books. What about genocide in the Old Testament, quote unquote? Check out the Hard Sayings verses books from the whole pile of them from InterVarsity. There's good material for people who do want to get down and answer these little questions. Mike and I are responding, you lose no matter what you do. But these guys want to defend the text. I say more power to them. They're doing a good job. Get some of those helps, keep them there, and share them with the people you're teaching Sunday school with or the guys you witness to at work and so on.
I think the Archer book and the one by Geisler and Howe, they have some good stuff in it, but then they have some stuff that is really just a stretch. Because they have a very rigid view of what is an error and what is not. So I do think they do have some stuff to offer, but I wouldn't take everything in either of those books. But I do like the Hard Sayings books. The Hard Sayings of the Bible is where they combine the New Testament Bruce one with the one for the Old Testament.
Right.
Yep. Gary, you mentioned the Old Testament alleged genocide commands, and that was the Defenders Conference theme last year. We had 4 different Christian views on that, and so that was a real fun event. It was the first time we had done a themed event where the plenaries were all, I mean, we had done themes before, but sort of this unique opportunity to bring the different perspectives together on one subject matter. So we focused on that. And you're right, the material is out there for people. I feel sympathy for people that think it's not out there, that they can't find the answers. For the person that grows up in a church, in sort of an anti-intellectualism church, where you just say, oh, well, you just got to believe. That's really unfortunate because people will not have their questions answered in those contexts. Or I could think of folks in very experiential-like contexts where it's about sort of recreating an emotional, spiritual high every Sunday morning. People like that may not have their intellectual concerns really addressed. You're right. The material is out there, though.
There's the, I don't mean to just plug my book here, but my book on gospel differences, there's one right there. Take a fresh approach to that where we don't have to come up with creative harmonizations that are quite strained at times. We don't do that.
Mike, just today, I wrote a letter to one of the top New Testament. Everybody would know his name if I told you. He wrote me and he asked me a question, and I said, Mike Licona's book on compositional devices. I told him that one and Craig Keener's new book, Christobiographies. I said those two are a 1-2 punch on new light on how to handle gospels and using as a background Greco-Roman historiography. So I just want to tell you, I'm bored with you on that one. I think your book with Oxford, why are there differences in the gospels, and the ones you're working on now and the ones you hope to work on this topic, long haul for you. I'm looking forward to great things.
Yeah, thanks, Doc. And that book by Keener, Christobiography, I read a draft of that. It's phenomenal.
Yep, and Keener will be one of the speakers at the Gospel Differences Conference next month. All right, let's take a question here from Jim. And I'm going to, Jim D. from San Diego, I'm going to kind of summarize and synthesize his question here. He's asking about the fate of the unevangelized or even those that reject God. When you consider the numbers standpoint, he says he's not a Calvinist, but even on non-Calvinist views, the vast majority of humans are going to hell. So he wants to know what your guys' view is on that. And specifically, he says, how is it justifiable? And how does it comport with a God of love if he provides for uncountable numbers of people to know nothing but misery for their entire existence in order to establish a people for himself that ostensibly will know bliss? So a tough one there.
in terms of those, let's say, that haven't heard the gospel, we don't know how God exactly is going to deal with them because the scriptures aren't clear on that. When you come to Acts chapter 17, and Paul is speaking to the Athenian, the philosophers at Athens, he says that God overlooked the times of ignorance. But now he commands everyone to repent, having furnished proof through raising Jesus from the dead. So, and in this context, he's talking about the unknown God, right? And trying to explain the unknown God. And he said, God overlooked the times of ignorance when there just wasn't enough revelation out there to reveal specifically who he was, if you were outside Judaism. So, but now he commands people to repent and follow Jesus, and he's raised Jesus and provided evidence for that. But what about those who've never heard? Well, they haven't received that evidence, so would they still be under a dispensation of God overlooks the time of ignorance and then judges them according to how they respond to what theologians would call general revelation, specifically Romans chapter 1, where it says that God has made it evident through his creation that there is a creator. And in Romans chapter 2, that he's put within our conscience the ability to know that we are morally imperfect, that we fail according to a standard and stand guilty before God. And based on those, if we acknowledge that we need God's mercy, we believe in a creator, worship the creator rather than the created, and we recognize we fall short and we need his mercy, that, I interpret Acts 17 as saying such a person could receive mercy in those times of ignorance. So if we look and we say a person is in those times of ignorance now, if they've never heard, well, then they're going to be judged according to how they respond to general revelation. And then I would also say that there are different opinions among even evangelical theologians on the nature of hell. That some of these descriptions of hell that we find in the New Testament can be interpreted in a number of different ways. Quite figuratively, an apocalyptic kind of imagery here that would not be meant to be understood literally. So you have a literal view of hell where we think the fire, maggots and things like that are literal. Some embrace that. Then you have what's called a metaphorical view of hell, that would state that hell is a real place where people are quarantined away from God's presence forever, but the fire, the flames of hell, the kind of torture stuff that we read in Dante's Inferno, those are just metaphors for judgment, and a good case can be made for that. And then there's an annihilationist view, which was embraced by F.F. Bruce, John Stott, and others, that, and I would state that people do receive some sort of punishment and then they are annihilated. And I think a decent case can be made for that. I would like to believe that view. Right now, I'm more of a metaphorical kind, but I do think a case can be made for the annihilation view. And so there's these different views. And my colleague at Houston Baptist University, Jerry Walls, he says there's even another view, a purgatorial view. His view is a little bit different than the Catholic view of purgatory, but he states that even Christians who believe, as well as those maybe who don't believe but want to know the truth, that they will be given a chance. But Christians also, the only way they're going to get into heaven is through sanctification. And if they are not sanctified, they just leave a worldly life, but they believe, well, they will go to heaven, but it's going to be a little different type of heaven for them until they become sanctified. And I don't necessarily buy into that view, but he does make a very interesting case for it that needs consideration. So there are these different types of view of hell and the afterlife. And so the question that's given, or the problem that's brought up by the questioner, kind of more or less assumes this Dante Inferno kind of literal flames and torture in hell for all eternity. And that's not necessarily what most theologians believe or the way they interpret Scripture.
Kurt, on Mike's, let me just say a couple odd things that back up Mike's different points. Mike said the hell one is not necessarily a majority view. I just did a blurb for a book published by Crossway. Crossway is one of the most conservative publishers in this country, and the fellow who wrote it is a very well-known professor of theology at Talbot Seminary, and I think it's called 40 Questions on Heaven. It's a good book, and he says in the chapter on hell, the majority interpretation among evangelicals today is the metaphorical view. And I was really surprised, and here's Crossway, a conservative press. He says the majority view today. Second point, Bill Craig holds this Molinistic view that some people know, and he holds that maybe God puts people together who are going to get a chance to hear, and those he knows are going to reject him have other decisions. That's something to consider. I had a professor buddy, he's passed away now, but he's a New Testament professor. He was a thoroughgoing Calvinist, maybe uncomfortable level Calvinist, but he still held Mike's earlier view that said that the dispensations, because he was a strong dispensationalist, the dispensations they run concurrently, and therefore in the Old Testament, where we have many people who don't know Israelites or their revelation. We have Job, we have Jethro, we have Melchizedek, we have Abimelech, we have Balaam. We have a lot of people who are listening to God outside the range, and God brings them in. What about them? Well, Mike was arguing that those other dispensations could exist now. No problem there. Let me make a comment, just one comment, bottom line. This question is far too complicated not to solve. This isn't a cop-out, but this question is far too complicated for us to rely on our picky-uni little brains to figure out what's going to happen. There is not a question in my mind that when we get to heaven, the Lord is going to answer this question in 2 sentences, and we're going to go, why didn't I think of that? It's going to be very, very simple, coherent, ethical, everything. But what I'm saying is there's many outs to this question. And if all you had was the Crossway book saying the predominant view today is metaphorical, that alone changes the whole picture. And it's a predominant view. I think there's so many possibilities. We can take kind of an agnostic stance on it that goes like this. All I know is that whoever gets there through Jesus Christ. That's the message of the resurrection. Whoever gets there through Jesus Christ. Who God brings in and to whom he applies these things, it's God's business. I'm not going to put myself on the throne and pretend to be God. I can wait for the answer because I know the resurrection's true, so there's going to be a just answer to these. God's not going to cop out. God's not going to lie. God's not going to whatever. There's going to be a just answer. And I'm willing to leave it there because you know the resurrection, you know the answer will be the good one.
Yeah, and I think Zondervan has put out 2 books called 4 Views on Hell, 2 different books.
They have.
My friend Doug Jacoby has written a book on heaven and hell, and it's one of the best cases for annihilationism I know of. It's called "What's the Truth About Heaven and Hell" by Douglas Jacoby. So for anyone interested, you got that book, plus you have the 2 books, 4 Views on Hell, if they want to investigate it further.
Yeah, so there are some options. There are viable options available for people who are struggling with this question. It's not as if there's one and only one view on that. I do want to take a moment here, engage with some of the comments. David VR's writing here. He says, a person with an average to below average IQ with a high school education probably doesn't have the brain power to really follow apologetic arguments. David, I would disagree with that. I think people with certainly below average IQ can follow apologetic arguments, but maybe it's just in how you're communicating the apologetic arguments. I think people can look to the starry heavens and they can make certain deductions that we're making about, say, the cosmological argument. Or they know intuitively that objective morals exist. In fact, sometimes it's the smarter people who struggle with understanding basic facts of reality. They struggle to recognize that if there were no objective morality, why should we even be able to critique some other country's views on morals? If this is all just a subjective thing, we're just talking about chocolate over vanilla. Who are we to really judge? There are really intelligent people that struggle with coming to the actual conclusions or the logical entailments of their own position. So I think people with below average IQ do understand some very easy to understand apologetic arguments. It's just maybe in how we're conveying those things. We've got here Gary, yeah, go ahead.
Real quickly. Last week in this, here I'm teaching this PhD course I've referred to a couple times, and some of the students in the class thought that Al Plantinga is properly basic. You don't have to understand the properly basic argument. Al Plantinga just says we can be as sure of God exists as we can be of knowing each other exists, other minds, and that's why people have intuitive senses of God. God has placed in us knowledge of God, and that's a sophisticated answer from maybe the most sophisticated philosopher of religion in the world, but nobody has to lay the argument out. In other words, everybody can know this proper basicality argument. It's there for the world. And that's probably why lay people often say to us, guys, I love your arguments. They're wonderful. I'm glad they're there, but I don't need them because I'm beyond a shadow of a doubt sure that God exists. Al would say, see, God's put that message in your heart. So, and if someone goes, well, it's the same thing all the cults and religions believe. The next step is, well, if you want to check it out, now go. If you're smart enough to ask that objection, now go look at the apologetic evidences and see who's got the data. But just as far as knowing God exists, that's knowable to everybody with first grade education. It's there. And read Alvin Plantinga if you want the real heavy stuff behind this.
All right, let's take a question here from Ian. He says, hi, I'm Ian from Washington State. My question deals with a hypothetical about the Adam and Eve story. Imagine if God had created two universes instead of one, both identical in every relevant way. It should be possible for Adam and Eve to obey God in one universe and disobey him in the other using their free will, resulting in a universe with the fall and one without it. God would know which universe would be which before creating them, and would presumably be free to create the universe which best suited his goals. Why do you think God went with our current universe instead of the other? Thanks for taking the time to read it. Hopefully that's not too long and to include in the actual show. Thank you, Ian. Very good question. So question about the fall and problem of evil. So what do you guys think?
Is Mike even there? I can't see.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I don't really.
Gary's like, I don't want to answer that one.
I don't feel too
No,
much
I'll be glad to jump in, but I just talk. So,
what I'd say, check out Bill Craig's recent series. I think it's called Creation and Biodiversity, and I think you can catch him on the Reasonable Faith YouTube channel. And he talks about Adam and Eve. He talks about the fall. And the first 11 chapters in Genesis, some really good stuff. He's done a lot of research on this, and so has some very interesting things to say. Each episode is only 30 minutes long, I believe. So check that out. That said, when it comes to the possible worlds that we have and the problem of evil, what you would have to show is that on balance, God has selected a world that does not have, is not balanced with the greatest amount of good and the least amount of evil to accomplish his will, with the maximum number of people saved and his glory. So it's really difficult to show that is not the case, that he's created such a world which on balance is the best way to go.
To show you I'm not trying to pass the buck to Mike there, let me take a shot. This alternate universe, have 1 million universes and let God pick the best one. Sounds easy. But to me, if God makes you free, not free where when you go to sin, he doesn't let you sin. If God is going to let us be free, The fall is going to occur. Adam and Eve are not going to live for however long the Bible says, or anybody else. Cain, Abel, don't forget murder gets introduced immediately. We are going to sin. Either we are free or we are not free. It is impossible, I'll throw that out strongly, it is impossible for us to be free, for God to create us free and never do anything wrong. Those two are contradictions. And I think a lot of people say that God is justified in allowing evil. If by allowing evil he creates a greater good, that's part of Mike's response about it turning out at the end for more good than not. But he's allowed to create evil, allowed ethically, if there's a greater good, or he curtails a greater evil by so doing it. And I would suggest, for those who don't want to allow the Christian answer, because I think the greatest good is the plan of salvation, the sending of his son, the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, it's called the gospel. Whoever says I do to him can be on the yellow brick road, and they're tracking toward the Emerald City. I think that's the best answer of all. But for someone that says, oh, you're way too religious for me, great. This whole program has been about evidence for Christianity. But let's go the other way. What's maybe the next best good thing God gives us besides eternal life? Now, by the way, somebody could say, well, if he wants to give us eternal life, let us give us eternal life. Let the first world be heaven. But see, God doesn't want robots. God wants people who freely choose to love. Even in secular circles, we debate this little line. Is it better to love than to have lost, or never to have loved at all? And there's a lot of preponderance. There's a lot of defense. It's better to love and lose than never to have lost. And God has loved and lost because a lot of his people have not chosen him. But he wants a universe where people choose him willingly. So he cannot start by creating heaven and make you free. He cannot start by making you free and keeping you from knifing somebody. But here's the best one. What's the next best thing? So you don't like the Christian answer of salvation. What's next best? How about free will? When I tell my students, next time somebody in your grade school class asks you, what good thing did God do that justifies all the evil? Say this to them. Would you push a little button that says you have no pain and suffering for the rest of your life? No physical pain, no emotional pain, no mental pain. You'll never have pain. But before you push that button, wait a minute, consider, you will never again be free. You don't pick who to date. You don't pick who to marry, what job to have, where in the world to live, where in the country to live, how to spend your money, who to pick for friends. You're going to have whatever friends the Lord gives you, and you could hate every one of them. But sorry, that's what you get. You can't pick what you want for dinner. When you go to say steak in the restaurant, the word liver always comes out of your mouth. You can never be free from this moment on. And I'll say to the people, great, here's the secular answer. You want your freedom. You want it above everything. Now, if you push that button, you'll never hurt, and you won't be free. I have tried this in a number of places, and virtually nobody pushes the button. Here's the point. Freedom is a great good. God has given us maybe the second greatest good to salvation is freedom. God has given us freedom. And if we choose to sin, if we choose to do what we want to, that's our business. But he's made us free. But the price of freedom is pain, and a lot of it.
You know, Doc, there's sometimes I've seen this online, and I saw it just a few months ago, where someone on the Bible and Beer Consortium Facebook page.
Yes.
They're a great organization, but
yes.
Dallas. But a believer asked the skeptics, if you knew for certain that Christianity is true, would you become a Christian? And a number of the atheists chimed in. Matt Dillahunty, a popular atheist, I had a nice debate with him a couple of years ago, but he was one of them, and they said no.
Yep.
So they definitely want their free will, and even if Christianity is true, they don't want it.
That's right.
Yep. Yeah,
That's
it's
right.
because, Christianity is not just about coming to a knowledge of a propositional truth, but it's about the will that one takes toward that truth. We can choose how we respond. I just did a great interview with Matthew Bates, author of Salvation by Allegiance Alone, his new book, Gospel Allegiance. Faith is so much more than just saying, oh, I think that's true. It's also acting upon that. And Mike, as you're saying, many of these atheists would say, even if it were true, I wouldn't follow Jesus. And so that's ultimately what it comes down to for many people, unfortunately. We've got what appears to be a big presuppositionalist in the commenters here, Tulip Doctrines of Grace. He says, philosophy is king in this live stream. Unfortunately, I've got news for this guy. He obviously doesn't know what philosophy is, broadly speaking, the love of wisdom. And so he thinks just because the view we're presenting here is different from his own, that this is philosophy. No, the views that we're defending here are biblical. And in fact, the traditional Reformed view defends natural theology and explores different areas. So unfortunately for this presupper, he's got a too narrow view of biblical interpretation. And we still got Doug chiming in here. Interesting seeing some of his comments. All right, let's get here a question about humility, intellectual humility. This question comes from Kit. Let's see, some poor grammar here. My question is, how Christian apologists know that their argument, their reasoning, and their case for Christianity will not be overcome by some information that we don't know yet. Maybe it will be in the future that information comes out and it will debunk our arguments. How do you know that that information that can be used to debunk your argument doesn't exist?
Well, we could say that about anything, right? It's not just Christianity. You can say that about anything. But we've got to, whether you're dealing in science or any bit of history or the truth of Christianity, you got to go with where the evidence is at that point, and you have an open hand. I mean, I can tell you, if archaeologists uncovered the bones of Jesus, let's say they come across an ossuary in Jerusalem and they open it up and you got the bones of a crucified victim, and there's a piece of papyri written in Greek and it says, "We fooled the world until today," and it's signed by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And on the side of the ossuary, it says, "Jesus, son of Joseph, he was called the Christ." And if you could prove somehow that that was Jesus rather than a fraud, like maybe taking DNA off the bones and comparing it with DNA of the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin, and you could say, hey, yeah, this is Jesus, these bones belong to him, well, then you'd have to give up Christianity if somehow you could disprove that he rose from the dead. There, you got his bones right there. But that doesn't mean in the meantime, given all the good evidence we have, that we shouldn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead and follow him. We have to go with where the evidence points, not at what some remotely possible evidence might turn up like that in the future. You got to go with probability. I mean, that would be like saying you met this girl and you want to marry her. Everything seems perfect. You even dated her for 5 years and everything seems perfect. And you say, yeah, but I might discover something in the future, and so I'm not going to marry her. You know, well, of course, you know, you always take a chance, and that's where faith comes in.
Kurt, a couple quick responses. I'm with Mike. I think this kind of response is kind of, here's another one. He used the marriage one. I'll use another one. What if a guy says, I'm getting a PhD in physics, but a question is really troubling me. I'm reading Einstein and post-Einsteinian physics. I'm meshed in this stuff. Here's my problem. I know it's going to be disproven in 300 years, so why am I studying this? It's meaningless because Einstein's no good. He's an idiot. I just know it. I don't know why, but I know he's an idiot. Mike's right. You can say this about every single thing in life. One more thing. Second thing, real quick. Mike says, what if you find the bones and it turns out to be Jesus, and we'll DNA the bones and compare it to the shroud? Okay, first of all, I'm going to suggest that, and Mike's just making this, you know, like you know, because Paul Meyer wrote a good book, A Skeleton in God's Closet, where that is exactly what happens. And if you want to read a mystery, his two books, A Skeleton in God's Closet and More Than a Skeleton, I think is the second one, two great what-if books would have changed Christianity. They are fun, but here's the big thing. You would never know they were Jesus' bones. You'd never know it. We don't know what Jesus' DNA is. And someone goes, well, compare it to the Shroud. Well, I got news for you. If you've been following the latest news on the Shroud, the carbon-14 has been totally debunked in just the last few months. And you can't compare it to the Shroud and throw Jesus up, because the Jesus of the Shroud looks like he's raised from the dead. Looks very clearly like he's raised from the dead. This is hot stuff. If you haven't seen the changes on the Shroud, check out the latest data. In fact, the journal in Oxford that published, the Oxford University Journal that published the original carbon-14 dating the Shroud to the Middle Ages, that journal had, well, one of the journals in that set that Oxford publishes, they published the follow-up now saying all the carbon-14 dating does not work. And what they did, well, I won't explain the whole thing, but a bunch of scientists came along and obtained, by the Freedom of Information Act, they obtained all these figures, and they found out that what the guys did was average the dates and come up with Middle Ages. You can't do that. They had so many outliers. The dates on the Shroud were here, there, here, there, here, there, here, there. What you have to do is throw out your sample and start again. And so, but that's my proof in the making there. The journal that published, the editor who released the original article in '88 is the guy who released this argument saying it's no longer valid. So if you compare the bones to the Shroud, it looks like Jesus was raised. I don't know why the bones are there, but he was raised, because we have a better evidence. We have evidence that he disappears from the cloth. So that's fun. But you can
just say he was
anything.
raised spiritually then, right?
There you go, Mike. But the point is, he was raised. Yeah.
All right, we've got 25 minutes left in our 3-hour event here, and I've certainly got a few more questions that I hope to get through. Cameron writes in, I'm a Christian, but I have doubts about the Christian eschatological story. Resurrection, a new heaven and a new earth, glorified bodies, etc. just seems hard to believe, even as a Christian. So, I guess if he had to put it in the form of a question, what do you guys think about that story? Is it too believable to be true? Is it just maybe apocalyptic? It's thinking of the nice things. I think of Gandalf in the Return of the King movie. He talks about the white shores with, I think it's Pippin there with him. And, you know, he just presents this beautiful portrait of what could be the case, you know, in the end of all things. Maybe this is the Christian way of doing that same thing.
If Jesus rose from the dead, then he's probably who he claimed, the uniquely divine Son of God. So he would know about heaven. He said that he went to prepare a place for us. You've got Paul, who says he had been caught up into that heaven and knew about things inexpressible. Jesus has promised us eternal life. Paul talks about life after death, that we're going to be with him. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. The dead in Christ are going to return with him, which he says, and in Philippians 1, to die. He prefers to die because he'll be with Christ in that case, like Gary mentioned earlier. Then Gary can mention all about the near-death experiences, many of them veridical, that talks about a heaven, right? People who have actually experienced it. So I don't know why it's difficult to believe.
To me, Kurt, the question sounds more like, I'm not judging any person who made the question, because a lot of people have issues with this, but it sounds to me like a bit of anxiety, like I'm supposed to judge my Christianity about what ifs all day long. I don't know what the question could refer to a bunch of things in eschatology, but the only one I'm sure of, as Mike said, is if Jesus, Son of God, who died on the cross for our sins, was raised from the dead, we say I do to him, as in a commitment to a spouse. We make a full commitment, hook, line, and sinker, to Jesus. We're on the yellow brick road. We're walking toward the Emerald City. Okay, think about all the things we know right there. We know Jesus is a Savior. He's the Son of God. He was raised from the dead. We can follow right now. We're pointed to a city. Our loved ones and friends can come with us, and there's eternal life for those who believe. Now, if someone says, well, yeah, but I don't know exactly what kind of body I'm going to come back with, or I don't know about which view of hell I like, or whatever, I say, you know what? Those aren't our categories. Those are God's categories. Let God take care of these things. But we know enough to get on that path, walk to the Emerald City. You know, I was doing this in a big church a few months ago, and after I left, somebody took some of that chalk that you write on cement, where you put the chalk on cement and it gets washed off in the rain. And this big church, and they put on the sidewalk, follow the yellow brick road, and they made a big pointer up to the front door of the church, and they sent me a photograph of it. I mean, there's not a lot of things you have to know to be satisfied and to rest in Jesus. And the things we can't figure out, wow, I've heard 4 views of this, I've heard 3 views of this, I've read all Zondervan and InterVarsity's 3, 4, and 5 views books. Wonderful. Maybe you shouldn't read them if they're causing problems for you. But that's not our business. We know enough to be happy. We know enough to be adjusted. We know enough to know that we want our family and friends there with us. Let's get on with the work. A kingdom is out there. God takes care of the pieces. We don't.
This question comes from Greg from Canada. He says, I've been a Christian for as long as I can remember. I don't know if I've ever felt the presence of God in a way I can recognize. God has never verbally spoken to me or given me some feeling he is there. My faith exists mainly because I see the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and I see the logical coherence of the various philosophical arguments for God's existence. But it isn't easy. Why do you think God is so hidden and or silent for many of us? Thank you, Greg from Canada. And even though he says he writes here as a Christian, I certainly think this problem of divine hiddenness would apply for non-believers as well. You know, if God does exist, why isn't there more evidence? Why doesn't he make his presence more known?
And, you know, I think Mike can go right to him. I think Mike's earlier point is really apropos here. When you ask atheists, now I could be wrong, I'm not Richard Carrier, but Richard Carrier has a book on why I'm not a Christian. I think I've read a summary of it. I'm trying to remember. I hope I'm not inaccurate here. But he gives 4 reasons why I'm not a Christian. 2 of them have to do with silence. So silence is an issue for people. But Mike said earlier, Dillahunty and other people, would you come to Christ if you knew it were true? No. Why not? I don't like you guys. I don't like genocide in the Old Testament. I don't like. No. Well, if you liked it, would you come? No. You know, people are free and they can choose what they want. But I think that's a big part of the problem. Why is that? Why is God's silence a question for unbelievers? Why is it an excuse if they wouldn't come if he were totally known? Why wouldn't they come? That's a cop-out for them not to be willing to come. For the poor believer who's gone through some hurt, I'm remarried and happily, but in 1995, the mother of my 4 children, I watched her get stomach cancer, and she was small anyway, small stature, but we watched her lose half her body weight. Our friendship in those days was just developing, and he drove a long way to come to the funeral. We put our body in the ground. I've got 4 kids who got scars all over them from emotional scars from their mother dying. She was only 43 years old. Things happen to believers and unbelievers. And folks, please don't think this is a broken record. But here's the theme of this night. If Jesus is the Son of God, he died on the cross, he was raised from the dead, we have a chance to say I do. Eternal life is going to be open to us. The same passage Mike quoted a little while ago, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Paul says we grieve, but not as those without hope. Do you ever stop and think about the difference of grieving with hope and grieving without hope? I may not know where the mother of my 4 children is right now. I mean, what category in heaven and what she's doing right now. But I do know she's there, and I know she's free and she's healed and she's not going to hurt anymore. So yes, we grieved, but not without hope. If all you know is the resurrection message, get on the yellow brick road, start marching, don't ever get off, and keep marching toward the Emerald City. It's enough for this stuff. Well, God's not, as open as I'd like him to be. Well, I'll tell you what, here's a little trick. Whenever you have an answered prayer, you know what's strange? I just put one of my files today. I put down really cool answers to prayer I've been privileged to see in the last 4 months. I had about 18 of them. About 7 of them were really major. Now, the problem is, as human beings, we more likely remember the things God didn't answer than the things he does. And I think if Christians would investigate their life and write down every time the Lord has touched them, but write it down, because I assure you we will forget it. Write it down. And I asked my PhD classes last week, how many of you have had experiences that you know were from the Lord? Just a personal, subjective. Every hand in the room went up, and these people are earning PhDs. Every hand in the room went up. I said, can I talk you out of Christianity? You can't. Two of them are those indie ears we talked about earlier. Can I talk you out of heaven? No. Why not? I saw it. I was there. We all have these experiences, but take a few notes. Don't blame God for doing something he didn't do. But again, we have the path. We're on it. Let's just keep marching. Let's not put up roadblocks up for our own faith.
You know, I remember years ago, Gary told me about keeping a journal for prayer. I haven't done it for a long time now, but I did when I heard Gary talk about this. And he talked about how, you know, keep track of how many of those prayers get answered. And then look at how many that you would consider to be impossible answers to prayer that they get answered. And I remember doing it for a few years, and I was just amazed at how many of those prayers got answered, even of the impossible prayers.
Yeah.
But you quickly forget those. And Doc, I remember you telling me, you called it, I think, the Snickers principle, how a kid tells the mom when she goes to the grocery store, hey, can you get me a Snickers? You never get me a Snickers. Well, what do you mean? I just got you one last week. Oh, well, get me a Snickers, you know, and we forget what God, all that he does for us quickly. But I can say, you know, I there's a lot of times that I sense the silence of God in my life, you know, to Greg here. A lot of time I sense the silence of God. I wish that God was more real to me at times. I just do. I mean, I have to admit my prayer time largely is just kind of boring. And it's, I just feel like, is there anyone even listening at times? But there are times, they are rare, but there are times when I sense a real intimacy with God. And then I do have those experiences in my life, probably a dozen or so, where it's, yep, I know God was connecting with me at that point. There's no question about it. God was speaking to me, he was communicating me. I mean, I could probably say 5 times that where, you know, I knew at that particular moment God was speaking to me and exactly what he was saying. It wasn't, I didn't hear a voice, but it's as though I did. And I know it was God doing it. Now, those times are rare, but they do happen. And what comes to mind, since Gary's mentioned Narnia a couple of times tonight, I think about the Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then the subsequent movie that came out. I didn't read the series, but I remember the movies. And, you know, there are times when Aslan shows up, and they're just sweet times. And sometimes they last for a little while, and sometimes they're just momentary. But he's not around all the time. He comes back, but he's not there all the time. At least you don't sense his presence all the time. And I kind of feel that way with my Christian life. There are times when Aslan shows up, and it's like, wow, it's the sweetest time. It's like, I remember a psalm that says, a single day is better when spent in humble praise than 1,000 years of living without God. And those times with Aslan are wonderful, but they don't happen all the time. In fact, they are rare, but they do happen.
Folks, hey, Kurt, one-liner. Why does the verse in the famous hymn say, count your blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done? You go, wait a minute, I was there, but you're surprised, right? Yeah, because I forgot it. So therefore, that's why you count them. You count them because otherwise you think he's never done anything. So I keep a file where I drop little slips of paper. Today, September 23rd, 2019, this happened. And I know I sense God's presence. Drop it in the file. And when I have days where I wonder where he is, I can pull the file out and read it and go, yes or no. Yes. How many of those do I have? Maybe 5 to 8 times in my life where I know God was present. How many times do you need in your life before you know he was present? How many times? And so those are good. But if we just go through life going, I can think of the 4 things I've been praying for years. Can you think of the 10 things where he was present? No, I already forgot them. I kept a list like Mike's. And I had an impossible prayer column. 67% of the prayers, hundreds of prayers that we paid for over a long time, had answers. Of the ones that were the impossible ones, 60% were answered. But you know what? Years later, you know how many I can remember, the 60%? 60% of hundreds, 2. I remember 2. But I can sure remember things I prayed for that weren't answered because they made me ticked. But I can't remember any of the answered ones. That's human nature. It's called sin. So mark it down. Be thankful and rejoice when the Lord does come to you.
All right, a question about Michael Shermer and some things he's said. This question comes from Dylan, who's watching on Facebook. One of the things Shermer argues against the Christian claims of the Bible is something along the lines of this. Just because we can confirm the names of cities and people described in the Bible, we can't therefore confirm the supernatural claims of the Bible. So he'll give a story about recognizable streets to the airport and then say that he was abducted by aliens and continue on his way. So what if maybe the Gospels and other passages in the Bible are just the work of historical fiction? So actual people, actual reference, but, it's all just sort of made up.
One sentence and give it to Mike. One sentence. 300 confirmed near-death experiences. I will talk about empirical evidence of the supernatural realm. That's one. Number 2, what has been this message for this whole broadcast? We have enough to know he's the Son of God. He died on the cross. He was raised from the dead. We're on the road. We're going to the Emerald City. And Shermer says, we don't know anything about supernatural things. Then you, Dr. Shermer, I know him. He's a nice guy. I've debated him. He really is a nice guy. But here's my challenge for him. Then you disprove the resurrection. Don't tell me stories about UFOs and pretend like you're really answering the Christian claims. Disprove the resurrection of Jesus. Until then, I'm on the yellow brick road. Mike?
Yep, I'd say the same. You got to look at the evidence for it. That does not disprove the resurrection. That's just another what if. That's all it is, and nothing more than that. And then you got to look at and say, all right, well, what about some of this evidence for the supernatural? Because Shermer's an atheist. So explain near-death experiences, the well-evidenced ones. Explain veridical apparitions. Explain extreme answered prayer. Explain paranormal phenomena. None of that fits in with an atheistic view of reality. It fits in perfectly with a Christian view of reality. So that's why when we look at the evidence for the spiritual dimension of reality, we look at the arguments for God's existence, for morality as well, and we look at the historical case for Jesus' resurrection, the evidence tilts very strongly in favor of Christianity being true, not in favor of atheism.
All right, let's, I think maybe we'll fit 2 questions in here. This question comes from Ryan, and he's asking about the passage of the woman caught in adultery, and he says that he's recently come to find out that it's not in the earliest manuscripts. He says, I admit that this has shaken me a bit, and it's taken a few days to process. How do I harmonize this, especially in light of all the current challenges to the inerrancy of Scripture by the ermines of the world? I know that the story has no effect on doctrine, but I wonder if I have to admit, it makes me wonder what else we don't know.
Well, first I'd say, look, since it's causing you to doubt, did Jesus rise from the dead? This is something that Gary has just ingrained in me over the years. Did he rise from the dead? Yes. Why do you think he rose from the dead? Okay, well, you got this, that, A, B, C. All right, let's just say that the pericope of the woman caught in adultery didn't happen. Let's just say it didn't happen. Would Christianity still be true given the resurrection of Jesus? Yes. All right, then why are you letting this shake your faith?
It doesn't even undermine the New Testament.
No.
If it's not there, it's not there. We're not talking about the New Testament, so.
Yep. And some scholars would say that, look, I have got a friend, John David Punch. He did his PhD dissertation on this pericope in John's Gospel. He wanted to prove that this was indeed part of John's original Gospel. He came to the end and said, it may be, it may not be. He just came to a part. He said, I don't know. A lot of scholars will say just because that it wasn't in there, maybe this was from Luke later on, or maybe it was another story. Like John says, there are many other things that Jesus did. And maybe this is just one that was known and someone threw it in John's gospel at a later time. Some have even suggested that John's gospel had as many as 5 editions. So maybe John didn't include this in the original one and included it in his 4th edition. Who knows? There's all different kinds of things. But like Gary just said, if this story was non-historical, if it never occurred, that doesn't do anything. And in fact, in our Bibles today, it's in brackets to say this does not appear in our best manuscript. So major on the majors, keep the main thing the main thing. Remember, if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true, period. So don't let this shake your faith. You got to put priorities on things.
I hope the questioner, Kurt, understands what we're saying. We are not saying if this is a problem, overlook it, we're going to heaven. By far the majority response is that John 8 was never in the originals. And if it's never in the originals, it's not a problem for an inspiration or inerrancy because it wouldn't have been inspired or inerrant. It wouldn't have been there. There are 3 texts like that, and they are in the King James because they come from very late medieval, not only medieval, late medieval manuscripts that are just not good manuscripts. Say what you want to, but these passages are just not there. So in other words, understand clearly, the questioner, understand clearly. It's not a passage that we go, oh, well, who cares? It doesn't make any difference. The vast majority of scholars, conservative and liberal, think that text was never there. So it's not a question of inspiration or inerrancy because it was never there.
Just like the ending of Mark, right? Mark 16, 9 through 20.
Yep. All right, before I get to the last question, I want to address the presup here in our thread. He says, what would the Westminster divines think of this discussion? My fellow brother, consider the words of B.B. Warfield commenting on the confession. He says, it's further to be observed that the confession, in asserting the perfection or completeness of Scripture, forgets neither the subjective disabilities of fallen man nor his needs outside the sphere of things necessary for God's glory, man's salvation, faith, and life, in which sphere alone Scripture is asserted to be objectively complete or perfect. The confession explicitly recognizes the inward illumination of the Spirit of God as necessary to enable man savingly to understand such things as are revealed in the Word. And it as explicitly recognizes that there are circumstances concerning the worship of God and the government of the church common to human actions and societies, which are to be ordered by the light of nature and Christian prudence. So here Warfield's even talking about how even the things which can be known through what today we call natural theology, the confession admits and supports to. So I think the presuppositionalists, which come from a relatively newer form of Calvinism called neo-Calvinism, are not in alignment with the traditional Reformed creeds. At any rate, okay,
I'd be more concerned with what Paul thinks than what the Westminster Divines.
Well, I would agree with you there, Mike. Yeah. But thanks for letting me get that out of my system here. The presuppositionalists, sometimes some of them have a very narrow view on some issues, and I think that's quite unfortunate. Okay. This will be our last question of the night, and certainly I want to thank everyone who's been following along and those that submitted questions. And this is a tough one from Jonathan. He writes, I'm 38 years old, and I want to believe in God, and I want to be a Christian. I've watched many arguments and debates for God's existence on YouTube, including you, Mike. It's all very encouraging and gives me some hope that there might be a real purpose to life. My problem is, I feel, if I take a leap of faith and try to live my life as a Christian, as if Christianity was true, I would have to take a chance of more hardship and suffering. He says mostly financially. I don't think I could handle much more hardship. It could put my job at risk by standing out as an odd person and not fitting in politically. I guess he thinks if he becomes a Christian, his political views will have to change. I could get another job, but would probably pay much less since I would have to start over, only having a 2-year college degree. I also have a toddler, so going back to school is not much of an option. But most of all, tithing. If I were to tithe, I would have to buckle down and give up some conveniences that make my life a little easier. I'm already stressed and overwhelmed with life, and may be a little bit of a weak person that can't handle as much as most people. I feel like I need to be at least 70% sure that God exists before taking the leap, but having trouble getting there. What can I do about this? And don't say pray about it, because I don't think that really helps.
Yeah.
So a good, tough question from Jonathan.
I can empathize with him on that. First, I'd say in terms of the tithing, I don't know that the New Testament teaches tithing. I know some pastors are going to get upset with me on that, but I don't know that it teaches giving. In fact, if you had the means to give, you should do more than a tithe. But we're to give as we are able, and he just may not be able to at this point, and I think that's okay. And if you can't give money, maybe you can give some of your time to the church and tithe some of your time to help out and do some sort of ministry work. Look, Jesus calls, he says, count your cost before following him. So, and a lot of people around the world, it's not just a matter of being able to provide well for your family and not struggling financially. It's a matter of you follow Christ, you lose your life, you lose your freedom. And we don't typically have that here in the United States. Now, some people have lost a lot of money and contracts because they're believers. Frank Turek, my friend, has done that. He lost a couple of contracts because he took a view that same-sex marriage is unethical, okay? And he lost contracts with Bank of America and another company, I forgot who it was, because of that. So it can cost you money being a Christian. It can cost you freedom. It can cost your life. Count the cost. Jesus is not looking just for people who will say, I believe in you. He's looking for disciples. He didn't make it easy for the rich man when he said, I've done all these things. What more do I need to do? Jesus tested him. He said, well, sell everything you give and you own and give to the poor. Then come follow me. And the guy didn't do it. Well, notice what Jesus did. He didn't say, all right, just come on back and pray this prayer to me right now and at least get heaven taken care of, because discipleship's a process. No, he let the guy walk because he's looking for disciples. So study the evidence. I think the evidence is more than 70%, can give you more than 70% confidence. And if you come to the conclusion that Christianity is true, just focus on the resurrection. If you come to the conclusion that Jesus rose, then you know Christianity is true. And then it's going to be a decision on whether you want to trust God to provide for you and your family. And you may not suffer the kind of consequences that you think you're going to at your job. But even if you do, God can still provide for you. But even if he doesn't, you need to make the decision on whether you're going to follow him, no matter what the cost.
One thing on the opposite direction, what does it cost you not to come to Jesus? Number one, you may not make any more than you're making now. You struggle to pay your bills. You still have child support. You've got issues going on. You're not making $1 million. And on top of all that, you've got to go through the rest of your life with the uncertainty that if there's a God and the Christian gospel is true, you're not in very good shape. So you've got to live with that angst of never being on the yellow brick road. Is the yellow brick road hard? Yeah. If you remember the story of Wizard of Oz, there are trees that throw apples. There's a big guy in armor with an axe. There's a lion. There's tigers and bears. There's flowers that'll put you to sleep. And you finally get, it's like Pilgrim's Progress. You finally get to the Emerald City. Think about what's on the other side. So you don't have you have what you have now. And, it sounded like the questioner was struggling a little bit there, as he says. But what about eternity? What about the biggest benefit of all? And you got to go through life with that angst. I would say having eternal life is the number one plus of living. And that's all because of what Jesus did. And I don't know, you're the you're the boss here, Kurt, but it sounds like we are ending where we started. Jesus is the Son of God. He died on the cross for our sins. He was raised from the dead. Say I do to Jesus. You're on the yellow brick road. You're looking for the Emerald City. And we might be able to explain a lot of the hard questions. We may not. But I'm on the road, eternal life. And you go, oh, that's just pie in the sky, the sweet by and by. Right. With 300 near-death experiences, healings today, Jesus, who has 8 different arguments for being the Messiah, nobody else has one of them. Yeah, tell me we don't have any evidence. Not true. I think it's the best of all worlds.
If I had to say one thing to Jonathan there, I would think Matthew 13, the parable of the pearl of great price. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls, who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. And you see, back then there weren't any banks in the ancient empire. What people did was they buried their treasures. And sometimes you might purchase a field with buried treasure. And so, in this parable, here's a story of what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's about someone who knows in advance, who he discovers this great pearl. And so in order to purchase the field, he sells everything that he has. He has to give it all up so that he can gain it all. And so for Jonathan, I want to encourage you to think about that. To gain it all, you've got to give it up in that sense. Of course, I'm not saying to be irrational here in your day-to-day operation, day-to-day life, but in terms of your spiritual life, take that step. And for many people that have been doubting, I want to encourage you to look at the evidence that there is for the Christian worldview, to consider exploring and reading what Christian thinkers have been saying for many centuries, and what folks like Dr. Mike Licona and Dr. Gary Habermas have said here tonight and have written in these really big books. And Gary, well, here, so I fibbed. Here's my last question. Gary, this is just for you. When are you going to finish the magnum opus?
Listen, I would pay you $1,000 to say, I got the answer. You're going to be done tomorrow. You're going to take a break. It's taken me 5.5 years. I am going to praise the Lord when this thing is done.
Good.
I want it to be done. I'm with you.
Yes, I've heard a lot of good things about what's coming, so I look forward to it being published.
Thank you, Kurt. And your last answer about the pearl was wonderful. That's a great response.
Yep. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on the 3-hour live stream event here. It certainly has been a lot of fun. Maybe we'll do it again sometime in the future. So thank you. God bless you. God bless the work that you're doing. It is so important, defending the faith and persuading people and persuading Christians themselves to be prepared to have the answer, but persuading non-believers to really consider and accept the message that Jesus has given to people to repent and believe. It's such needed work, and I wish that the Christian church, especially in America today, would be more supportive of it. So thank you for all that you're doing, guys.
Thanks for having us on, Kurt.
Of course.
Good time.
God bless you guys. All right, well, if you've been joining us for this live stream event, I want to thank you for joining us. If you haven't yet already, be sure to follow us, subscribe on our YouTube channels there. You could be watching on Dr. Mike Licona's channel. You could be watching on Veracity Hill or on Apologetics 315. Be sure to subscribe so you can get some of the latest video content that's coming your way. And if you're watching on Facebook, be sure to like and follow us as well. And we'd love if you could invite your friends to follow these various pages as well. It's certainly been a wonderful opportunity, an honor to be your host this evening and to chime in here and there on some things folks have been saying. Again, my name is Kurt Jaros with Defenders Media, and I hope that you'll have a good evening. God bless you.